Eerieville-Wondrous Destiny, Chapter 1.
Molly's heart pounded fast and her footsteps swooshed as she ran through the woods. Her long, puffed dress turned brown at the bottom from the dirt she was stepping on. Why didn't I bring a map? She thought. She stopped running and grabbed her mushroom-shaped hat she was wearing. Apparitio Via, she exclaimed as she put her hand inside it. It had white circular dots. Suddenly, a compass came out of her hat. She looked at it, trying to identify what exactly it was. A compass? She exclaimed with a frown. I regret coming here. I just wanted to explore the forest a little. Her magic hat worked fine. Out of it, she could conjure items that would help her in a time of need. The only problem was that she did not know which direction her home, the Bee Queen's castle, was. East? West? Maybe north? She put the compass on her pouch, her mushroom hat back on her head, and kept on running on a dirt road that was barely visible. Her long, red hair moved like a wave as she ran. This road must take me somewhere. The road had overgrown bushes and grass. Obviously, the road had not been used much in a while. No use denying it. She was lost. A thick, humid forest surrounded her, and sunset was only a few hours away. The trees smelled like a combination of pine tree needles and strawberry. It was foggy, and there were several types of trees and plants in that interesting, unique forest. Crimson was tending to his crops when she was passing by. He lived several miles from Eerieville. He was wearing his usual clothes. A green and white sports shirt that said, "Weed Destroyer Yard Services," and green sports pants with white stripes. On his feet, he wore what seemed to be comfortable tennis shoes. Green and yellow. He also wore a green and white cap with the letters W and D. Excuse me, sir, where exactly am I? How do I go back to the valley? Crimson could not believe his eyes. How in good luck's name could the princess of his dreams come willingly into his very own home? Your Majesty? What are you doing in your servant's humble abode? He asked with a shaking voice. I am lost, sir. I need to go back to the castle soon. Queen Bee will be worried. I see, he stuttered. Well, it's a deep honor and privilege to witness you here, Your Majesty. I'll be glad to escort you back to your castle. Oh, is that a guitar you have there? Asked the princess as she pointed to an old guitar that was lying on the porch. It is, Your Majesty, he replied, then lowered his head, afraid of what she might ask next, which she did. Sing me a song. I haven't practiced in a while, Your Majesty, he stuttered. It's okay. I want to hear you play, she demanded. The princess was used to having her way most of the time. Sing to me while you take me to the castle. The pair walked merrily towards the castle, and Crimson sang many songs with his guitar. Crimson thought he was in a magical dream. He felt all those sparks inside him, and he could not believe yet that this very moment was happening. In his wildest thoughts, he fantasized many times of professing his love to her and proposing. Such happiness cannot be, he thought to himself as they both walked side by side. He saw Princess Molly for the first time at an equinox parade a while back. Spring. She was standing on a royal cart passing on the parade, waving at everyone, while everyone at the parade praised her. He was love-struck by her that very moment. He was standing within the multitude observing the parade. Time stopped for him. Only her and himself existed in his field of vision. He was mesmerized by her red hair that blended perfectly with her mushroom hat, by her wide blue eyes, by her smile, even by the way she moved. Suddenly, she glanced in his direction, and he was sure she had noticed him. She didn't. She was just waving in all directions towards everyone. She was certainly out of his league. He was just an ordinary farmer and craftsman. She herself was Princess Molly of Mushroom Valley. There was a sense of untamed, organic beauty to her. She didn't even wear makeup. But at that moment, the green trees around them seemed to dance merrily as they walked through the pastured hills side by side. The early spring cool breeze caressed their skin just at the right rhythm. Nothing else existed in their minds but that loving moment. It was like a blissful dream. Unfortunately, fate had other plans for Crimson that day. and fate was about to knock his guitar down. Lord Darkshadow, a very powerful sage who ruled Eerieville, had his scouts constantly patrolling the forest looking for potential blood victims. They saw Crimson and Princess Molly passing by at a distance. Singing, skipping, and all. Crimson had no idea of how dramatically his life was about to change. "Is that a royal girl?" asked one of the scouts to the other one with him. They were both dressed in black, wearing white masks. He was wearing a red bandana on his neck. "Look at her fine clothes. She must be royalty," the other one responded. "Let's get her then. Lord Darkshadow will be very happy when we take her." Lord Darkshadow was not a very good person. Some say he is not even a person, but instead, a zombie-like ghost trapped in a skeletonized cloak. Yikes! The scouts positioned themselves for the ambush. They hid themselves behind some trees on top of a hill. Crimson and Princess Molly walked merrily past them on a dirt road without noticing them. They had no idea of what was about to happen. The two soldiers looked at each other and nodded, signaling it was time to ambush them. They walked swiftly, hiding from tree to tree as they approached them. Soon, they had reached the dirt road and started tipping-toeing quietly towards them from behind. Now they were just a few feet behind them. Crimson was then able to see their shadow on the ground dirt with the corner of his eye and immediately looked back and saw them. "Are these your friends, Princess?" he asked. Molly looked at them closely and frowned, trying to find a resemblance of some sort. Just before she could conjure up an answer, the scout with the red bandana grabbed Princess Molly and the other one pushed Crimson back. Crimson attempted to break loose, but he was punched in the stomach and fell to the ground and was unable to breathe. "Quick, help me tie the girl," said the scout as he held Molly's hands behind her lower back. "Bring me the rope." The other scout left Crimson hurt, kneeling on the ground. "Here," he said as he reached the other scout. "Hold her. I'll tie her up." He then began taking a thick piece of brown rope from a bag he was carrying on his hip. "I will not let them take my princess." "It's now or never," Crimson whispered to himself. He began to slowly stand up with his hands still on his stomach. "Hurry! Tie her to the tree. We gotta take care of this jerk," said the red bandana scout holding Princess Molly as he saw Crimson stand up. "No, let me go," yelled Princess Molly at the top of her lungs as she tried to break free. The other scout's hand trembled as he tried to tie her hands. "Hold her still," he screamed to the red bandana scout. "I am." "Hurry up," he responded. Once they tied her hands, they picked her up and carried her to the nearest tree to tie her to it. "Ah, why are you doing this?" "Let go of me," cried Princess Molly as she was being taken there, her legs kicking in midair. They tied her to the tree, and now she was unable to get free. "Let's take care of this loser," said the red bandana scout as he popped his neck and stretched his arms, preparing himself to fight. They ran towards Crimson, who was already up and limping towards them. "Hold him," instructed the red bandana scout as they were about to reach him. The other one nodded and grabbed him from the back, holding him tight from the underarms. Pow! Pop! Crack! Ag! Crimson cried as he was being punched in the face, shoulders, and stomach. Soon he was laying on the floor, touching his stomach again. Blood from his mouth and nose dripped onto the dirt road. Crimson was unable to get up and saw how the evil scouts ran back towards Princess Molly. The scout with no bandana was shaking his hand side to side rapidly, soothing his hand from the pain of punching Crimson. "Let's take her now," he said as he squeezed and rubbed his pained knuckles. The red bandana scout untied her from the tree and lifted her on his shoulders. "We need to hurry. Let's get her to Lord Darkshadow before sundown," he said as he held her. The other one nodded in response, and they began to run towards Eerieville. "No!" Princess Molly continued to cry and tried to set herself free by hitting and kicking. "Crimson needs help." "I will go rescue you," Crimson mumbled as they walked past him. I promise."
Eerieville-Wondrous Destiny, Chapter 2.
Molly had never been to Eerieville. A noble girl like her would never have a reason to. For some time, she even thought it was a made-up place that parents would say naughty kids were taken to. Does that mean I am naughty? She even thought subconsciously. And the rumors were true. She saw ghastly figurines and people who looked like zombies. Trash, stench, and puddles of mud everywhere. The homes and buildings were made out of rotting wood, probably because of all the foggy moisture that was there most of the time. The sun barely reached through the clouds and fog, making it dark for most of the time. In Eerieville Castle, Lord Darkshadow and other royals were standing around a table looking at a map. They were planning their next attack on unconquered lands. They are gathered in a circular table, inside a planning room of some sort. The fog made its way through the castle as it entered its windows, even reaching the room they were in. I'm so close to gaining control of you, said Lord Darkshadow, slamming the map with his hand. He was referring to the entire known land of Niberia. He served the Mosquito Queen, and they almost had all of it, except for Mushroom Valley. Princess Molly was forcibly taken by the two scouts with her hands tied behind her back. Ouch, she exclaimed. That hurts. She felt a pain up her shoulder joints as the scouts pushed her, holding her from her hands. Greybite, a bear-like humanoid, approached and stopped them. Smells like royal blood, he said. He smelled her hair and even touched her hat with his nose. Members of the royal court gasped and silently gossiped as a reaction to Gravebite's mention of royal blood. Bring her to me, exclaimed Lord Darkshadow, not pleased with his underling's interruption. The two scouts continue to push Princess Molly a few more steps towards Lord Darkshadow when they are interrupted once again, but now by General Fiamma. He inspects her up closely and curiously sniffs her like a dog. General Fiamma is a dragon humanoid. He stands upright but has a reddish dragon face, with scales. He can fly, throw fire and all. I said bring her to me, screams the skeleton-faced Lord Darkshadow. General Fiamma turns his face toward Lord Darkshadow and grunts. Unintimidated, he approaches his commander and says in a deep, raspy voice, Lord Darkshadow, even though you are the Queen's pet, it is me who has brought Her Majesty countless victories. It is me who has expanded her empire beyond the vast mountains. It is I who can command the flame in her favor. Ha 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 ha. You amuse me, General. A mighty army of dragons you command indeed, and thanks to you we are vast and magnificent. And your talents are much valued and appreciated. So I hereby propose to you, may you soar in the skies in battle, and may we bore ourselves with the matters of politics of the world, replied the canny Lord Darkshadow. General Fiamma grunts and steps away, allowing Princess Molly to be taken before Lord Darkshadow. Your insolence and arrogance were to be expected, Fiamma, said Lady Annalise Gertrude, the Mosquito Queen's commander of possessed dolls. Her high-pitched, almost robotic voice and sharp words made Fiamma's nerves tense up. General Fiamma growls back at her in response and steps away. Princess Molly finally reaches Lord Darkshadow. What have we here? Lord Darkshadow analyzes her, inspecting her from top to bottom with his curious, black cavity eyes. Where did you find her? In the forest bordering Mushroom Valley, responded the red bandana scout. And what is a precious little princess like yourself doing so far away from Mushroom Valley? Asked Lord Darkshadow in a sarcastic manner. He then glanced at the members of the royal court, whom were pacing back and forth, their eyes locked in on him and Princess Molly's conversation. Princess Molly was looking down. She did not even lift her face to see the slithering lord. Speak, child. She did not move at all. It appeared as if she did not fear Lord Darkshadow. She didn't even move an eyelash. Huh. No pressure, honey. Silent or chatty, you're still worth the same to us. Ha ha ha. Everyone in the court laughed maniacally. What else do you know about our little princess treasure? He asked the scout who was holding her as they came in. She was walking accompanied by a young farmer. We left him bleeding on the ground. I see. Great job indeed, boys. You finally did something good. Ha ha ha. Take her to the cell. And best treat her Irie. The Mosquito Queen will be very pleased with this gift. Keep her pretty. Ha 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 ha. Princess Molly is taken away to the castle dungeon. As she walks with her head down, she thinks of Crimson laying in the ground bleeding and secretly begins to shed red tears. She is surprised when she sees them. She's never shed red tears before. Crimson, she whispers to herself while clenching. I will avenge us.
Eerieville-Wondrous Destiny, Chapter 3.
Unlike Princess Molly, Crimson was not originally from that land, or world even. He ran a small landscaping company in El Paso, Texas. Weed Destroyer Yard Services. He was also a student at a community college. One evening, he was coming out of class, headed to his car, when he saw a full-sized mirror in the middle of the school garden. It was just standing in plain sight. He frowned his eyebrows in curiosity when he saw it and slightly twisted his head sideways, like a confused dog would. Full-size mirrors in the middle of a school garden aren't very common if you think about it. I must be hallucinating, he thought as he rubbed his eyes to see more clearly. After all, it's been a tiring day for him. It's probably a prop from the theater club, he thought. He was beat up from being out working in the sun all morning and then attending a full day of school. He was also hungry. Money was not something he had an abundance of, so he tried not to eat out as much, and he had forgotten to pack lunch that day. As a result, his mind was a bit foggy that day. However, he approached the mirror to see it up close. When he was in front of it, he could see the reflection of his face. The mirror seemed to be an ordinary mirror. It reflected normally like a mirror should, revealing even the not-so-beautiful aspects of our bodies. But suddenly, as Crimson was analyzing it, the mirror sprouted bright neon colors. Red, green, blue, yellow, and purple. Then suddenly, without warning, the mirror sucked him right in. Just like that. Like a powerful, neon color vacuum. Yeah, pretty bizarre indeed. It happened in just a few seconds. Before his tired brain could process what just happened, he ended up in the magical world. He was, naturally, a little confused and disoriented at first. But after some time, he began to notice the beautiful and interesting aspects of that world. Heavy bushery, untrimmed trees, neon, colorful, shining mushrooms sprouting from the ground. The dense humidity filled his lungs. The air smelled like wet tree bark and strawberry pineapple cake. He was so enchanted with that new place and explored it tirelessly. After some time, he even forgot where he was originally from. He forgot about his school and his landscaping job. He even forgot to study for his upcoming art history test. Yikes. The only thing he remembered was that he wasn't from that magical land. That didn't seem to bother him much, really. Maybe it was something in the air. He seemed pretty joyful exploring this new world. He had been in that world inside the magical mirror for months so far. The only reason he knew his name was because he was carrying his ID in his wallet. Jotzi Crimson, it read next to his face. But now, after the kidnapping of Princess Molly and the fight with the evil scouts, Crimson lies bleeding on the ground and struggles to stand up. He leans on a tree trunk, but when he tries to stand up, a piercing pain in his ribs weakens his legs, and he falls back to the ground. Unable to fully stand up, he crawls on the floor. As he does this, two individuals approach him, Raven and Capra. Raven is fully dressed in black. Even his face is fully masked with a black hood. Capra is white from head to legs. He is fully covered with a white robe and a goat mask. They stand in front of him and begin to pick him up. Crimson grabs them by the hand, not knowing who they are. He hadn't even seen their faces. Once he was finally up, Crimson supported his arms on their shoulders, almost using them like crutches, and managed to walk with one foot. Seir Ianua, exclaimed the white goat-faced Capra, extending his right hand in front of him, facing east. Suddenly, a magical portal opens up in front of them. It had bright neon colors and electric rays, just like the magic mirror did. Crimson felt a strong déjà vu as he saw this, but still couldn't remember his past experience with the magical mirror. They all went inside the portal. They ended up in another place, just outside a small mud brick cottage house in the middle of nowhere. Gray clouds covering the sky. A wooden gate with white faded paint surrounding the place. Crows and vultures flying in the air. Goats and pigs were walking upright inside the wooden fence. The smell of rain and manure filled the air. Masked people plowing the land. A slight hint of fog above the dark brown, humid soil. They go inside the house and take Crimson to a bed in a room there. Rest. Get better, boy, said Capra looking at Crimson, who is lying in the bed. Where am I? Precisely where you need to be right now. You need to heal. Crimson had many more questions, but his exhaustion and pain was stronger than his curiosity at that moment. He put his head on the pillow and quickly fell asleep, smelling the fresh, manure-filled air. The following day, he woke up very late. He managed to sit down, but his knees were still injured, and he failed to walk on both legs. He grabbed himself from nearby objects for support, and that way made his way inside the house. The masked maidens were inside the kitchen. Masked women with long white dresses attending him like nurses. One of them had a purple mask, the other one a mint-colored one. Good evening, the two of them said, almost simultaneously. Evening. Yeah, we're about to serve supper. Feel free to sit down. We'll serve you in a bit. After an awkward pause, Crimson asked, where is the bathroom? Just outside. You see that little cabin? It's in there, the one with the purple mask replied, pointing at a small cabin through the window. May I use it? Of course. Feel free. You must have many questions. Lord Capra and Lord Raven will be here in a few weeks, and they will answer all your questions. Their voices were surprisingly sweet and crisp. Weeks, exclaimed Crimson. Yeah, that should be enough time for you to heal and start your training, she replied. Training? What kind of training? I can't stay here to train. I have to go look for Princess Molly. She is in trouble. Crimson said in a high-pitched cry. Self-defense. And no worries, you will have time to rescue her, but you gotta get ready. You won't get far if you leave now. You can't even walk. Not to mention what they will do to you if you get into another fight, said the one with the mint-colored mask. Crimson was speechless, his mouth wide open. What a reality check. He didn't know how to fight. He had never needed to. He didn't even believe in fighting, but if he said that to the maidens, he would appear cowardly, so he remained silent. I'll go use the restroom now. Crimson excused himself, bowing his head. Of course. Make yourself at home, the one with the mint-colored mask responded. Crimson started to walk with crutches towards the exit door and then glanced back at them. Oh, and thank you very much. I am indebted to you and very grateful. The masked maidens nodded and giggled. Dinner should be ready soon. Crimson was still intrigued at the sweet yet alien aspect of the masked maidens. He wondered who they were and why such beautiful young maidens were wearing those purple and greenish masks. Once inside the restroom, he stood in front of the mirror inside the bathroom. How miserable I look, he thought. His swollen face still had some blood, bruises, and dirt. Once completely alone, he cried silently, grinding his teeth. I will not cry, he whispered. Not until I save the princess and get my revenge, he promised himself while clenching his fists. After he ate in company of the masked maidens, he went to bed and fell asleep visualizing how he would execute his revenge. And although he had a lump in his throat, he kept to his promise of not crying. Tomorrow I will begin my training, even if Lord Capra and Lord Raven are not here, he thought. Princess Molly is my destiny, and I must save her.
Eerieville-Wondrous Destiny. Chapter 4.
The following day, Molly was taken out of Lord Darkshadow's dungeon and taken to the most powerful empress of the known world, the blood-sucking Mosquito Queen. The source of her power is a diamond ring, one of the mystical stones that had fallen from a green comet in Iberia during ancient times. With it, she could harness and summon lightning bolts at her will. Before she had acquired that mystical stone, her ancestors would hunt for blood. Now, her dark-robed sage priests go to all corners of the land and forcibly get sacrifices for blood. Most of that blood goes to her young offspring. Due to her power with the diamond stone, nobody dared to challenge her will. Mushroom Valley was one of the only kingdoms that was still free from her grip. That's thanks to the Bee Queen, who governs there, where Princess Molly is from. From Eerieville, they traveled by horse carriage for about a day and a half, crossing forests, hills, and lakes. It was ironic for Princess Molly to witness the beautiful landscape while being held prisoner herself. There was a sense of freedom due to the fresh air and natural landscape, but also the harsh reality of her hands being tied. The air was clean and smelled like pine trees. Lord Darkshadow and Princess Molly finally arrived at the Mosquito Queen's castle. It sat just at the bottom of the austere mountains. Like Eerieville, it was mostly cloudy there, so it was mostly dark. The fogged mountains could be seen behind the castle. The entrance door had a river with red water flowing around it. Princess Molly could imagine the worst as she finally saw the red river with her very own eyes. They continued on horseback down the castle and went across the rotten, wooden bridge, which was supported by gray bricks standing on the red river itself. As they approached, the enormous castle door opened. They entered on horseback. At the gate, they were met by 2 mosquito guard soldiers, whom were hovering and guarding the entrance. The top of the entrance door reads, Benedictus Noster Mater. I have a special gift for Her Majesty, said Lord Darkshadow to the soldiers. Wait here, one of the mosquito soldiers responded in a high-pitched voice. His wings made a buzzing sound as he took off. He entered the door, while the other mosquito soldiers stayed guarding outside. Soon, a cloaked, hooded figure stepped outside the door. Why do you wish to see the Queen, Lord Darkshadow? Sage, this is Princess Molly of Mushroom Valley, and I have brought her to the Queen. I see, he responded as he analyzed Princess Molly up close, smelling the likes of her, lacing his fingers through her reddish, thick hair. Let me see your teeth, dear, he told Molly as he grabbed her by the chin and opened her mouth. He then smiled. Royalty indeed. Come with me now. Inside the castle, the walls were made of clay bricks that were textured by a dry blood residue, making them brown with a crimson accented color. There were bodies of fresh water all throughout the interior of the castle. Ponds, flowing rivers, fountains. The dew coming from the waters refreshed their lungs. They walked on a wet, slippery clay floor and were led by the sage to a large door past a staircase. As the door opened, light from inside the room blinded them, causing their eyes to squint automatically. They walked towards the inside of the room as they became adapted to this new light. Once inside, they realized the light was being reflected by gold ornaments within the room. At the center of the throne room is the royal throne itself that sits Her Majesty, the powerful Mosquito Queen. Behold the fountains of blood, exclaimed Lord Darkshadow as he extended his right hand towards a fountain sprouting a dense liquid, which was dull and dark red like withering roses. The Mosquito Queen sits on her throne majestically, at least 7 sage priests to her sides, one in front. The diamond ring glows and sits comfortably on the tip of her top left limb. It seems to have a will of its own, as if it were yearning to be electrified by lightning bolts. Her Majesty's smile boasts her lust for power. Although the most powerful mystical stone rests comfortably on her finger, she seeks the other mystical stones and fears them being used against her. That's why she surrounds herself with cloaked, powerful wizards she calls sage priests, who bring her sacrifices to feed her hungry offspring who then grow to become mosquito soldiers and expand her empire. But today, she was being presented with a special gift. Your Highness, this is Princess Molly of Mushroom Valley, said Lord Darkshadow as he bowed. She glanced at the sage who led them there, who nodded in response. Bring her before me, she exclaimed. Lord Darkshadow pushed the princess as he grabbed her hands, which were tied to her lower back. After a few steps, she stood in front of the Mosquito Queen. The Mosquito Queen was not your average mosquito. In Niberia, mosquitoes are huge, almost human-sized when they stand up on 2 limbs. Her Majesty, however, is way taller than that. Monstrous. She stood up in front of Princess Molly, perhaps on purpose to intimidate her. She stood more than twice her size. She was the tallest one there. Taller than the sage, taller than Lord Darshadow by at least 5 feet. She was very thin, but her wet and slimy body seemed rigid and sturdy. Her limbs had piercing edges as sharp as knives. Her proboscis is long and as sharp as a real needle stretching out from her mouth. As a final act of intimidation, she opened and expanded her wings, making a big swoosh sound. That made Her Majesty look even bigger. Molly felt her stomach turn. She was about to vomit. The swampy stench penetrated throughout the castle, and the Red River flowed inside as well through canals, one of them even reaching Her Majesty's throne room. And now, the Mosquito Queen was standing in front of her, appearing as big as a dragon. Just before she could vomit, the Mosquito Queen spoke to her. "Welcome home. Dear," she began. "You'll be staying here for a while. And the only way you'll return to Mushroom Valley is when the Bee Queen pays her ransom, the ransom of her entire kingdom. Ha ha ha. Believe me, she will do this for you. That's how much she loves you, I'm sure. But when you go back to Mushroom Valley, it will already be under my power. Thanks to you, the known world is now mine." She then glanced at the sage who led them there. "Priest, take her to the dungeon and place her in the secret cell." "As you command, Your Highness," he responded and took her away. "Sir Lord Darkshadow, great job. You will receive a worthy reward and promotion for this. You will now be in command of most of my sages. A battle will come. But first tell me, how did you acquire this precious gift?"
Eerieville-Wondrous Destiny. Chapter 5.
The sage went down with the 2 soldiers to take Princess Molly down to the dungeon. They had to make sure she would not break free using her magic on their way there. Her hands were still behind her back, preventing her from accessing her mushroom hat and conjuring something that could be used against them. As they walked down the round brick staircase, the sage's legs were shaking, and he felt like he was going to vomit. He was, after all, imprisoning a very young sorceress of noble blood who had just not unlocked her full power quite yet, and nobody could really predict with certainty what catalyst, if any at all, could unlock her full potential. And once it was to be unlocked, if it ever would be, what would she be capable of doing? For now, she could only conjure up items with her magic hat, but the power itself came from the magical mushroom hat, not from her. Princess Molly was taken down blindfolded to the lowest parts of the castle where the dungeon was. They walked down the red brick staircase. Her white, puffed dress began to turn even more brown and reddish like clay as the bottom of the dress dragged on the floor where they walked. Her red hair became tangled from being pushed so much by the soldiers. Her mushroom hat would cover her head from dirty water droplets that were falling from the ceiling, as well as from falling guano. One of the mosquito soldiers, with his hand on her back, was guiding her steps all the way down there. The other soldier appeared to be monitoring their surroundings at all times, especially the large brick windows around the castle, making sure nobody would come and rescue the princess. The Queen Sage, on the other hand, was monitoring Princess Molly, constantly inspecting her for any signs of magic she could use against them. On their way down there, she could hear the squeaks and steps of rats echoing deep through the walls. She felt a shiver run up her body and began to watch her steps, walking more slowly and cautiously. She smelled the oil and wood burning from the lightened-up fire torches that hung from the walls and illuminated the entire brick staircase. She heard something that she couldn't quite recognize. It sounded like coyotes far away, but not exactly. It had a more human sound than just a howl. She even thought for a while that those sounds might be coming from cries of ghosts. The spirits of those she thought were agonizing sacrificed victims who died inside the castle, echoing the walls. She never lost hope, however. She knew that Crimson, as weak in battle as he was, would go look for her and that he would not give up. There was a unique connection between them both, even though they had just met. It's almost as if their very souls recognize each other, as if they understood the very angels and demons that were in them both. She then realized, as she was being imprisoned, ironically, that she did not feel alone anymore. There was something that drew them close together. Something more than attraction. She felt her chest pumping faster. She felt a surge of power run through her chest out to her arms. She felt powerful enough to break free. So much that she knew that she could do it if she wanted to. That was it. The catalyst for her magic was not the spells she was taught in class. The source of her magic was love. It was faith. It was a simple belief. That was the catalyst. As they approached the lower parts of the castle dungeon, the sounds that she previously had not recognized became clear now. They were not the sounds of ghosts, but the cries of living people who had been imprisoned down there. She knew because she could now hear metal clashing sounds from the prison cells. She gasped and stopped walking. "How could you do this to people?" she exclaimed and began to shake her body as she tried to break loose from the ropes that tied her hands. She felt a fire burning in her chest and her head. The blindfold cloth began to disintegrate. She then recited a spell she had learned in class, but had never been able to actually make it work. "Luminous incendus," she exclaimed. She broke free from the yellow ropes that tied her hands. Her hands were now filled with a yellowish flame, and she did not think twice to point them towards the mosquito soldiers. A surge of yellow heat waves resembling flames came out of them and hit the soldiers. They both fell to the ground, making a thumping and sizzling sound. The Queen Sage had been increasing his aura as he witnessed this, readying himself to face Molly in combat. Princess Molly now faced the sage up front and took a defensive stance as she prepared to battle him. They were so close to the bottom of the dungeon that the prisoners' screams were much louder. Whoever was down there would now hit the metal cell bars harder with objects, making a clashing sound that echoed across the dungeon and castle walls. They knew someone was approaching them. Princess Molly was ecstatic. She felt more powerful than ever. Her aura began to glow, forming a yellow and pink cloud around her. The sage could not hide his fear. His hands began to shake. He thought about running away, but realized that if he did that, he would be tortured and imprisoned by the queen at the very least. The sage's fear made him take a few steps back, and Princess Molly noticed his fear. She then said, "Release the prisoners, and I will let you go." The sage got the keys from his pocket and gave them to Princess Molly. His hands were shaking. "Pathetic," Molly said as she grabbed them. She slapped him and tied him with the rope that previously handcuffed her very own hands. "That's so you won't get in trouble with your vicious queen." Princess Molly then rushed towards the bottom of the cell and saw the prisoners behind the cell bars. "You poor souls," she cried as she opened the cell doors and let them all out. She then threw a plasma magic ball towards the castle wall next to the cells, which made a hole big enough for them to escape. "Thanks for letting us go," some of them said as they rushed towards the opening. "The Mosquito Queen was going to have our blood." "Go! Run fast!" The explosion was surely heard all the way to the top of the castle. "Soldiers and sages will be here any second now," Molly replied. The last prisoner to leave, who was a young woman carrying a baby, asked her, "Aren't you coming with us?" Molly replied, "If I go with you, they will catch me and harm the rest of you. It's best if I stay. But don't worry about me. Someone will set me free, I can assure you." The woman couldn't hold back her tears. "We will come back for you," she said with a broken voice. Then she left. Now, with all the prisoners gone, Molly placed herself inside one of the cells and locked herself inside. She threw the keys outside the cell, far from her own reach. After about a minute, soldiers and sages of the queen reached all the way to the bottom of the dungeon, including the sage she had handcuffed. They saw her and saw the hole in the wall. "Where are the prisoners?" one of the sages asked Princess Molly as he was catching his breath. His hands were on his knees, panting, exhausted from running. Molly heard him, her head facing down to the cracked concrete floor. She then raised her head, looked at them straight in the eyes, smiled, and replied, "They all escaped." Then she looked back down and giggled.
Eerieville-Wondrous Chapter 6.
"Hit it harder, Crimson," Capra commanded. He and Raven had arrived to Capra's farm early one morning just before sunrise a few days later. By then, Crimson was able to walk and even run again. "I'm so tired. I need a break, please," Crimson exclaimed. He had been training and working out a few hours that morning. "Your foes will give you no break. Hit the punching bag harder now," Raven said. "Ah," Crimson exclaimed in frustration, feeling his muscles hurt and weaken. His fists closed tighter, and he felt a fire burn through his chest. Suddenly, a surge of power and inspiration came from deep inside him. He felt like it was really possible. His muse was not so distant now. "Good. Take 5, said Capra. Crimson fell to the ground, and even though he had difficulty catching his breath, he smiled throughout his 5-minute break. "Raven will now teach you the sword," said Capra. Raven and Crimson slashed swords until lunchtime. The rest of the day, the party of 3 climbed up a mountain. For most of the way up there, if they were not walking, they were playing with the sword. Crimson continued his training for several days, engaging in many exercises and practicing techniques for battle until he became good at it. "Master Capra, I know that I am probably not ready yet and that there's still much for me to learn and become a great fighter, but I must leave now. Molly is in danger, and I have to go help her." "Who am I to stop you? Who am I to be in the way of love?" replied Capra. "Go through the desert and keep on walking until the snake wizard finds you." "Just walk until a wizard finds me?" Crimson asked with eyes wide open. "Good luck, warrior," exclaimed Capra as he opened a portal and pushed Crimson inside. "Ah, what is this?" cried Crimson as he went inside a vortex of illusion portal.
Eerieville-Wondrous Destiny, Chapter 7.
The portal took him to a desert midday. There were some cacti with spines, mesquite trees, and desert plants all around. Desert fauna were present as well. Hares, millipedes, centipedes, ants, hawks, rodents. Holes in the ground all over, which Crimson assumed housed snakes inside. The sky, clear and blue, with only a few clouds adorning the landscape. At a distance, there were a few mountains and hills. Crimson could only hear the wind and his own footsteps. The yellowish, crisp sand burned Crimson's feet as he walked. After many hours, he was tired and gave up trying to find the snake wizard. The reddish sky announced the fast approaching sunset. He gathered twigs from mesquite tree branches to light up a fire. The sound of howling coyotes and fire ember crisps was all that was heard. "Where's the snake wizard?" he thought. A few hours later, he heard a voice behind him. "Excuse my delay, little one. I was hunting. Thought you might be hungry." "Who are you?" responded Crimson, startled. The man smiled in response. He was wearing ragged, blue and brown torn clothing. He had long, black and gray hair and was wearing a pale, colorful mask. "Eat this hair I got for you and rest. Tomorrow I'll tell you why you're here." "Wait, are you the snake wizard? Show me what you have to show me now. I have to go rescue my beloved princess." "Oh, and please don't wake me up. I hate it when someone interrupts my sleep. Just dig yourself a hole here and sleep. It will get cold later," responded the masked man. "Wait, don't leave me here. Where am I?" Crimson yelled, but the desert masked man disappeared. A few hours later, the mesquite wood Crimson had collected had burned out, and he had regretted not making a hole to sleep in earlier. He made one in the middle of the dark, cold night. He slept in it for the remainder of the night. It really did help keep him warmer. When morning came, he heard a voice. "Time to wake up," said the masked desert man as he splashed some cold water on Crimson's face. "What the heck?" exclaimed Crimson as he jumped from the ground. "Let's go meditate," instructed the desert masked man. "What? Meditate? I need to go to save my beautiful princess muse. I told you yesterday. That will be your first lesson here." "Are you the snake wizard?" asked Crimson with a croaky voice, feeling a lump in his throat. "Tell me now." "That's what they call me," he responded. "And you're here because you're too weak to fight, no doubt. You need the power of the mystical stones to even stand a chance in rescuing your pretty little princess. Crimson stood quiet, with eyes wide open, unable to conjure up words to respond to that. Let's climb up that hill, and inside there, we will meditate. I'll race you there. Okay, wait, responded Crimson as he rushed behind the snake wizard. Once they got there, Crimson said, Your mask, is that why they call you the wizard snake? It sure looks snaky to me. Ha ha, clever boy. Yes, indeed, he responded. Are you shy? And why do you live alone in a desert in the middle of nowhere? I'll answer all that and reveal many more things once we begin to meditate. After the race up that hill, which the snake wizard won without much effort, they reached the top. Sit here, close your eyes. Think only of the air you feel, instructed the snake wizard. Crimson closed his eyes and could feel a cool breeze on his arms and face. He hadn't even noticed before how refreshing it was. He even felt the moist dew going inside his nostrils into his chest. There was a mild sting in his lungs due to the air he hadn't even noticed before. It was rich, pure but very dry, and it smelled like a combination of different desert plants. After about 5 minutes of meditating, the snake wizard began to talk. Power, it can consume you. That is why you have to practice letting go of it from time to time. Just like in meditation, you let go of thoughts that distract you from the present. Likewise, when power begins to consume you, you have to practice letting it go, or else it will consume you and bring you down to the very clay that carpets the earth. But how can that help me now? I have no power, Crimson asked. I will give you something beyond your wildest dreams. Something very powerful, and since I will do that, I have to teach you also how to protect yourself from it. Protect me from being powerful? That's a bit ironic, don't you think? And what is that power that you will give me? Asked Crimson. You will see. Literally. Ha ha ha. Okay, Crimson replied. The snake wizard's sarcastic laughter made his stomach tense up. He swallowed his own saliva. But first, I have to make sure you understand the lesson. I understood it perfectly, responded Crimson in a fast, high-pitched voice. Don't let power consume you. Meditate to practice letting go. Yes, that is what is to be done. But have you understood the concept? It usually takes something miserable to happen for someone to fully understand it. Is that what happened to you, Snake Wizard? Responded the Snake Wizard in a deep, growling tone. You could say that. What miserable thing happened to you? Before I tell you, let me just explain one more thing about power. Love. You see, love is a catalyst of freedom. To have power over someone else is weak. Love, on the other hand, and the service you offer to those you love, that is real power and the good kind of power. The power of the mystical stones is nothing compared to the power of love and the power of service. Did you say the mystical stones again? I know the legend. Heck, I believed in it for some time. Why did you stop believing it? Asked the snake wizard. Because they obviously do not exist. I've never seen one. The love you feel for your princess, do you see it? No, I just feel it. Wow, I think I get your metaphor. They are real. The mystical stones, said the snake wizard. Crimson got fired up. The fire stone, the flying stone? Where are they? I will defeat everyone who gets in the middle of me and my beloved princess. He jumped and raised his arms as he had won a long-distance race. I thought you said that you had understood the concept. Plus, those aren't the names of the stones, responded the snake wizard. What do you mean? I did it. I passed your test. I meditated. I won't let power consume me. I'm ready, exclaimed Crimson. His words were as fast as the wing beat of a hummingbird. You're clearly not ready. You haven't even found your first mystical stone, and you have broken your peace, said the snake wizard calmly. But I have to go rescue the princess. These are not toys, boy, roared the snake wizard as he stood up. His voice echoed on the nearby hills, and it was so loud, it made Crimson crunch down to the floor automatically. The smile on his face turned grim, and he lowered his head like a scolded child. They're more like weapons. Listen to me, boy. No amount of training anyone can give you can prepare you for them. They can destroy everything you love, everything you or others have built in seconds. Their power can hypnotize you and distract your focus for decades if you let them. Wow, I see your point now. Really, replied Crimson in a soft voice, his head still facing down. For your own good. I hope you have. But before I tell you how to get them, you have got to promise me one thing. The Snake Wizard sat down again. Of course, Snake Wizard. Anything. Crimson responded. That you will meditate every day for a year, and then once every week or every 2 weeks while you have what I'm about to give you. What? That's a big request. But I need to go now, so I promise you that, sir. Good. Thank you, responded the Snake Wizard in an affirmative manner. Then, the Snake Wizard began to take his mask off. He struggled to do this since the mask appeared to have become part of his face, and as he took it off, bits of skin from his face came along with it. Crimson had his eyes wide open and locked into what he was witnessing. His mouth was wide open. Once the Snake Wizard completely took off his mask, he exclaimed, "Man, the light is so bright." He covered his eyes automatically from the intense light, which he wasn't accustomed to because he had been wearing the mask for so long. Here, take this mask. When you wear it on your face, it will reveal the location of the mystical stones. Crimson could finally see the Snake Wizard's real face. It was so pale. Although he had wrinkles on his hands from aging, his face seemed tender and made the Snake Wizard appear young. How long have you been using? Crimson was about to ask how long he had been wearing that mask when the Snake Wizard opened up a portal in front of him. Oh no. Good luck, boy, said the Snake Wizard as he kicked Crimson on the butt, pushing him inside the portal. Wait, I have so many questions. No, not this vortex thing again. Ah, Crimson cried as he was being eaten by the vortex of illusion portal. The Snake Wizard fell to the ground, looking up at the cloudy, blue sky. His breathing was heavy and fast while he was catching his breath. Finally, after all these decades, he thought. Good luck indeed, boy, he whispered while he began to sob and shed a few tears. Heaven knows you will need it. Now I have nothing. I've finally been set free.
Eerieville-Wondrous Destiny, Chapter 8.
After traveling through the portal, Crimson ended up just outside of the Mosquito Queen's castle. Great, a castle, he thought. The castle was dark gray and black, resting at the bottom of some tall mountains, the austere mountains. It was the Mosquito Queen's castle, where Molly was held captive in the dungeons, but Crimson did not know that. Many pointy towers surrounded the castle, a reddish swamp around it. There was a grassland between the castle and the edge of the forest he portaled in. He then looked at the mask that the Snake Wizard had given him, which he was carrying with his right hand. He finally put it on for the first time. He saw everything in dull, grayed out colors except for some shiny, neon-colored objects in the distance. Yes, those shiny objects must be the mystical stones. He jumped. I'm going to go get them now so I can save my princess. He then saw the castle and a blue shining light coming from inside the upper parts of the castle. What? Is there a mystical stone inside the castle itself? He asked, astounded. I'm going to go get it. He ran to the castle entrance door and was greeted by 2 mosquito soldiers, whom were both standing upright on 2 of their 6 limbs. On their other limbs, they were carrying swords, whips, and shields. Why are you here, young lad? Hello, Mr. Guard Soldier. My name is Crimson, and I would like to get the mystical stone that is inside the castle, please. I need it to save Princess Molly. I'll do anything for it. Work, run errands, you name it. I will give it back as soon as I save her, please. The mosquito soldiers both glanced at each other and frowned. Did you say mystical stone? Yes, sir. I believe there is one inside the castle, Crimson replied. You better get out of here, lad. Stop believing in those fairy tales about magical stones. But sir, they're real. I can assure you, cried Crimson. One of the soldiers grabbed Crimson and put his sword against his neck. If you know what's good for you, son, Go back to school and stop looking for those fantasy stones. Crimson was shocked. His eyes were wide open and his face turned red from embarrassment. He didn't know what to say. He did not wish to start a fight, which he would probably lose. He thought that maybe he could go search for the other mystical stones instead. All right, good sir. I meant no disrespect. I'll make my way out, Crimson said with a shaky voice as he bowed to them. Good boy, said the other soldier. And might I suggest you also forget about your pretty Princess Molly? Why do you say that? Do you know her? Is she here? Asked Crimson in a louder tone of voice as he took a few steps towards them. Just get out of here, boy. No, please tell me what you know about her. I know that she's way out of your league. Ha ha ha. Both Mosquito soldiers laughed maniacally. She's in trouble. Please let me in. Both Mosquito soldiers push on Crimson's chest with their swords. Their swords were medium-sized, sharp with the blades curved. One last time, boy, get the damn out of here, said one of the soldiers while pushing him with his sword once again. That's when Crimson finally had a reality check. Even though they were both slightly shorter than him, he noticed their weapons, their long pointy needle proboscis, coming out of their mouths and their wings. One of them began to hover a little above him, making a sharp buzzing sound. He already knew that he probably did not stand a chance against both Mosquito soldiers, and even if he did, who knows how many more of them are inside, and what other creatures and evil magic might be there. For the first time, he ultimately realized how disadvantageous his position was in all this. He really was alone. Crimson swallowed his pride and decided to go to look for the other mystical stones and to come back fully equipped with them to release the princess. Thank you for your help, gentlemen, he said and left.
Eerieville-Wondrous Destiny. Chapter 9.
Crimson's feet made a rustling sound on the sand while running away from the Mosquito Queen's castle through the thick forest. The trees were very tall and very thick. The humid air felt almost toxic. He grew tired after a few minutes, rested his hands on his knees, and gasped for air. Moments later, he put on the mask to see the location of the other mystical stones. The brightest ones must be the closest ones, he thought. He began to walk towards a shining green one in the southeast. But after walking for a while, his legs felt like they would cramp, so he decided to lay down on the ground, facing up. He still had his mask on and looked at the moon, which was bright and full. To his surprise, two shining objects, one white and one pink, were shining right on the moon's surface. He jumped right up. There's mystical stones on the moon. How is this possible? How could I even get to them? A new surge of energy ran through his nerves, which made him forget about his tired legs and began jogging south towards the shining blue stone. After hours of walking, he spotted a large, crystal clear lake and decided to go quench his thirst there. Once he was there, drinking, an otter came from underwater right in front of him. Welcome to Paladin Lake, he said. Crimson choked on the water he was drinking and fell to the ground, landing on his butt and hands which he'd automatically placed behind his lower back. Oh, you're scared of me? The otter asked. Wait until the dragons come and drink water here. Haha, and the lions. But I must willingly admit, the lions are much friendlier than the dragons. Huh, dragons come here to drink water. Crimson stuttered with a broken voice. Which realm are you from, young lad? Asked the otter. Realm? Crimson asked. Yes, if you're here, you must come from one of the realms of Niberia. Well, I come from school, of course, he replied. He was not in the mood to explain to the otter he had no idea where he came from. I see. You do good by staying in school, you know? My name is Napoleon. By the way, what is yours? Crimson. Honored to make your acquaintance, Sir Crimson. Likewise, Mr. Napoleon. And what are you doing here, besides drinking water, of course? Asked the otter. I am here to rescue my beloved princess, Molly, but I need to find the mystical stones first, responded Crimson. Princess Molly is in danger? How so? Queen Bee must be worried with agony, he exclaimed. He then noticed the white, colorful mask that Crimson was carrying. He sharpened his focus on it, squinting his eyes a little. He slowly twisted his head like a confused dog as he slowly approached it. He even seemed hypnotized and attracted by it, like if it was calling unto him. He now began to slowly open his mouth as his gaze dove deeper. He felt a hint of a déjà vu, then said, I think I've seen it before, but someone else was wearing it. He then grabbed it, gently but instinctively. It's to find the mystical stones. I can let you touch it, but please give it back, said Crimson reluctantly, his hands shaking a little. Uh-huh. I knew I had seen it before. A long time ago. It was. Suddenly, a female voice interrupted at a distance. What is taking so long, Napoleon? Come, Crimson, let me introduce you to my beautiful wife. Okay, Crimson replied. I'll be delighted to meet her, Mr. Napoleon. We're coming, darling, yelled the otter. We're coming? Who are we? She replied at a distance. You'll see soon, dear.
Eerieville-Wondrous Chapter 10.
Inside the otter's house was a wooden table made of wood sticks and lichen. The poor lighting inside was remedied by candles made of beeswax, which illuminated the underground hole they lived in. The walls were made out of moist grass and clay. It's so cozy in here, said Crimson as they entered the otter's house. So this is your new friend, dear? She asked in a high-pitched, sweet voice. Yes, indeed, dear. Crimson, meet my beautiful, charming wife, Layla. A real honor to meet you, Mrs. Layla. And thank you for your hospitality. Welcome to our humble abode, Sir Crimson, she replied. I'll cut to the chase, dear. I am a man of few words and abundant action, said Napoleon. I am going off on a new adventure. You see, our new friend Crimson needs some assistance and a wise guide to accompany him. It seems that he is not familiar with these realms. Princess Molly had been kidnapped. There was an awkward silence for a moment, and Layla looked at Napoleon with intense eyes that were wide open. Oh no, Sir Napoleon. This time, I am coming with you, she finally demanded. Huh? Napoleon's mouth opened wide in awe, and his eyebrows frowned as he heard his wife's intentions of tagging along. Oh yes, dear. Last time you went on one of your adventures, you didn't return for 2 years. I am not having that ever again, she exclaimed, making it clear she wasn't taking no for an answer. But my lovely Layla, there are so many dangers out there. I can't have you exposed to those dangers, replied Napoleon with a cracking voice and a lump in his throat. Well, to be honest, I'm pretty bored of staying here at home, and I know you will protect me from evil's hand. She replied. Napoleon was lost without words. He paused and thought for a few moments. He was beginning to realize that Layla was determined to tag along. I suppose I can't stop you, my dear. You can't, she said with a smile on her face. You weren't expecting this, were you, dear? She said as she approached him. She caressed his cheek gently and said, Don't worry so much. I will be fine. Soon after, the otter pair packed a few bags. Layla left a note on the wooden table that read, Mom and Pops are out on an adventure. We'll be back soon. Kisses to Amy and Dorothy. Love, Mom and Dad. She left this in case their kids and grandkids came to visit them. They blew off their oil lamps and candles and made their way to the door leading outside their house. As they turned around to take one last look at their house, Layla said, I will miss you, my beautiful home. Stay clean. Then they all stepped outside the door, shut it and locked it. Layla saw the trees as she began to take her first steps into the sun-filled horizon. I have a good feeling about this. I feel adventurous. I like your optimism, dear. But it's not a field trip, okay? It's a quest with many dangers, Napoleon warned. What do you mean? A quest is an adventure. Stop being so sour. You're getting old. Don't kill my vibe now, she said. Like if you're so young yourself. Napoleon replied. What did you say? I am young. What's your problem? She hit her beloved husband on the head with her hand. Ouch, that hurt, Napoleon said as he rubbed his head. That's what you get for calling me ugly. I didn't say you were ugly, Napoleon replied, confused. You sure did, you grumpy otter. Be good now and stop being naughty to your beautiful wife. Okay, Napoleon said, still rubbing his head. You two are just adorable, Crimson said with a giggle. I'm glad that you're helping me. Thank you both. Sure thing. We have a long journey. Where does the mask say the stone is? Napoleon asked. Crimson put on the mask. It's over there. He pointed east. That's towards Stardust Forest, replied Napoleon in a serious, knowledgeable fashion. Stardust. Yay! Layla exclaimed. Are there pixies and fairies? And magical star powder there? More like hungry bears, wolverines, and wolves, dear, her husband replied. Oh, Layla sighed, now with a serious tone. Her smile turned into a grin. But yes, there is a Stardust fairy guardian there. She's the one that probably has the mystical stone. Napoleon said, let's go there. It's a 3-day journey.
Eerieville-Wondrous Destiny. Chapter 11.
After a full day of walking, they rested beside the Wrath River. Napoleon and Layla caught some fish. They made a bonfire, told jokes and stories, ate and slept. The next 2 days, they continued to walk east at a calm pace. The trees were becoming larger as they traveled, and before they noticed, they were already walking deep into the woods. They had entered the Stardust Forest. They rested near a small lake there. Once again, Napoleon and Layla caught some fish and made a bonfire. They all ate and slept for the night. After a few hours, the bonfire burned out. Without fire, they were in danger, exposed. A lone wolf slowly approached meticulously. Its paws stepped gently and slowly on the ground to avoid being heard. Its breath could be seen coming out of its mouth because of the cold. Its eyes were set on the triad sleeping in front of him. He was exhausted and his stomach hurt due to his hunger. Since he was a lone wolf, hunting was much more difficult for him. He stopped and examined all 3 at a distance. Layla seemed to be his first lunch preference, but she was on the other side of Napoleon. But he had to make a choice. Fast, it chose Napoleon. He was closer. He was too hungry and couldn't afford to risk losing his prey. He walked slowly towards them. As he got closer, he stepped on a branch that snapped. Only Napoleon heard it and woke up. The wolf saw this and began to sprint towards them. Napoleon saw him dashing towards him. Ah, a wolf, he yelled. That woke Layla and Crimson up. Before they knew it, the wolf had his jaws and claws on Napoleon. The wolf began to run away with its prey, Napoleon, in his mouth, but Crimson dashed towards them and was able to grab the wolf's ankle and stop him. My husband. Layla soon caught up to them. Leave my husband alone, you dirty rat. She hit the wolf on its head with her hands. The wolf looked at Layla, astounded, growled, and crouched his face. Crimson was now able to grab full hold of the wolf and wrestled with it. The wolf scratched Crimson's face and arms with its paws, leaving some scratches on him. Get my sword, Crimson yelled. Layla was too busy hitting the wolf and trying to rescue her beloved husband, and she didn't even hear Crimson. Layla, my sword, Crimson yelled. No response from her. Layla, listen, I will save Napoleon, but you've got to give me my sword. No. Layla finally heard him. She saw Crimson, whose face was bleeding from the scratches. Her eyes widened, then she began to look around. Where is it? It's over there, Crimson said, signaling with his head. Next to those rocks. I see it, Layla said. I will save my husband. She ran towards Crimson's sword and grabbed it. With it now in her hand, she sprinted back. Good, Layla. Now give it to me, Crimson commanded. Layla sprinted past Crimson with his sword, ignoring his request. Leave my husband alone, you dirty rat. She reached the wolf and raised her arms with the sword, ready to attack. Layla, Crimson yelled in disbelief at what he was seeing. The wolf's eyes widened as he saw Layla with the sword. He immediately let go of Napoleon, his prey-to-be, and bit Crimson's hand, which was still grabbing his ankle. Ah! Crimson cried and let go of him. The wolf began to sprint. It was too late. Layla's arms were already set in motion for the attack, slashing the sword toward the wolf's back. The wolf was already in motion. She missed his back, but hit the wolf on the left thigh, slicing its skin open. The wolf cried, but still managed to run away. The sword, still in Layla's hands, was left stained with wolf's blood, its sharp point now resting on the ground. "My dear, are you okay?" Layla asked Mr. Napoleon. "You were supposed to take care of me. What happened?" Napoleon was dizzy and disoriented. He had scratches and blood all over, and a deep wound in his stomach from the wolf's fangs, which was bleeding heavily. "Quick! We've got to cover the wound to stop the bleeding," Crimson said as he reached toward one of the bags. He ripped a piece of cloth. "Hold him," he instructed Layla. She did. He cleaned the wound with water from the lake and began to wrap the piece of cloth around his pierced stomach. The cloth, which was blue, slowly turned dark red. It even dripped a little bit of blood. Crimson held down the cloth by applying pressure on the wound. After about a minute, the bleeding stopped. "You will be okay, Mr. Napoleon." "Will I?" Napoleon replied with a soft, faint voice. He looked at Crimson, and his eyes slowly began to close. He passed out. "My husband!" Layla cried. "My husband is dead," she said with a sobbing, breaking voice. Then she cried. "Calm down, Mrs. Layla," said Crimson. "He is not dead. He just fainted. We've got to get him some medical help and fast." "Yes, let's go," she replied. "We must find the Stardust Fairy Guardian Mr. Napoleon was talking about. She should have access to medical aid." Layla was picking up her fainted husband in her arms to carry him. "Let's hurry, Crimson," she said with a still semi-sobbing voice. "No worries, Mrs. Layla, I'll carry Mr. Napoleon. He is not that heavy for me." "He's my husband. I must take care of him," she replied. "I'll be cautious with him. Please, let me carry him." Layla was reluctant to let go of her husband. "I promise I will," said Crimson, now gently grabbing Napoleon from Layla's arms. "Please." Layla finally nodded and let Crimson hold him. "I don't know where the Stardust Fairy Guardian might be. Let's just walk deeper into the woods. We'll try and figure it out," Crimson said with an honest and affirmative tone. "We better," Layla said. They began walking deeper into the woods.
Eerieville-Wondrous Destiny. Chapter 12.
They walked for several hours through Stardust Forest. As they traveled at night, the only sounds they heard were some insects and some croaking frogs at a distance. At sunrise, they began to hear birds chirping and a waterfall. Mr. Napoleon was still asleep. Crimson would put on the mask, and with it, he could see the location of the mystical stones. But as he approached the green light, which he assumed was the mystical stone they were after, it moved its location. They were very close now, no more than 100 yards away. "Someone has been following us," Layla said. "What? Who? Why do you think that, Mrs. Layla?" "I've started to hear rustling in the branches of the trees," she continued. "All sorts of animals dwell amongst the trees, ma'am," Crimson said, exhausted, not in the mood to argue. "These are different. It's a gut feeling. Someone has been watching us. I feel their eyes on my back," she was convinced. "We're almost there, Mrs. Layla. It will all be all right." Crimson was trying to end that nonsensical conversation. He was tired from carrying Mr. Napoleon all night. He put on the magical mask again. They were about 300 feet away now. "This can't be," Crimson exclaimed. "What happened?" Layla asked with a broken voice, distressed as well. "The mystical stone is on top of a tree," he replied. He took off his mask and put it back on several times, but the green light shining was still atop a very large pine tree. Let me see, commanded Layla. It took Crimson several more tries to put on the mask and off to make sure of what he was seeing before he handed it over to Mrs. Layla. That green light is the mystical stone, she asked. That's what I assume, he replied. You're not sure, boy. She glanced at him with wide eyes. Well, I've never used one of these before, he said, signaling at the mask with his eyes, and I've never actually ever seen one of these magic stones, his high-pitched voice breaking up, clearly under frustration. If you want to save Mr. Napoleon, that's our only hope right now. I was just asking, she said, lowering her head and giving the mask back to Crimson. Do your thing. Let's get there, boy. They walked about 60 more feet, and all of a sudden, they knew something was wrong. Everything turned quiet all of a sudden. The chirping of birds, the rustling of trees. Almost as if someone turned the off button of the forest noise. They stopped and glanced at each other, Crimson burrowing his eyebrows, and Mrs. Layla had her eyes wide open and a grin on her face. Before they could make sense of what was happening, they realized that they were being picked up into the air by a net. They both yelled. A few seconds later, they were hanging on a net, attached to some tree branches. It's a trap, Crimson screamed. Mrs. Layla was still screaming. They heard rustling footsteps approaching them. What have we here? Asked a voice coming from the ground. Who is talking? Crimson demanded an answer. An otter and a human, an unlikely alliance, a voice said. Crimson, who was in an uncomfortable position, hanging from the air, struggled to locate the voice coming from the ground. He changed positions several times, but did not see anybody. Where are you? He demanded. Show yourself. I am not hiding, the voice replied, giggling. Is that a talking squirrel? Crimson cried as he saw a squirrel wearing full body armor standing just below them. Crimson's eyes and mouth wide open in disbelief. Why is a squirrel wearing armor with some kind of royal crest? He had never seen such a thing. You mean several squirrels? Another voice announced its appearance as it came out from the trees. Soon, there were at least 7 squirrels, all armed with bamboo armor and metal swords. You're not from around here, are you, boy? Mrs. Layla posed the obvious question. Where are you from? No, I'm not from here, I'm from. Before Crimson could answer, the squirrel demanded an explanation. What do you seek in this forest? We need medical attention for our friend. He was bitten by a wolf, and we fear for his life, Crimson replied rapidly. He was secretly glad he did not have to answer where he came from since that would take a long time to explain, and he couldn't think straight at the moment. I see. The leader squirrel analyzed Mr. Napoleon and his wound, then put a cigar in his mouth and ignited it. He then whispered something to another squirrel, who took off running afterward in the same direction where the mask signaled the green mystical stone was. We can take him, but you must wait here, he firmly said, now looking at Crimson and Mrs. Layla. What? How do we know you'll heal him? Crimson sighed. You don't, he replied, letting out some smoke from his cigar. But you don't have a choice. He belongs to the forest now, and the forest will care for him. No, Crimson demanded. We stick together. At least let me go with him. Mrs. Layla interrupted. He is my husband. The squirrel glanced at Mrs. Layla and pondered for a moment. I am sorry, Mrs. Otter, but I cannot allow you to come with us. We will return him, healed. But as of now, the forest has claimed your husband, and we must act quickly to save him. He bowed his head in a gesture of respect. Okay, well, hurry up then. My Napoleon, cried Mrs. Layla. We will now bring the net, and we will seize you and the human, madam, and then we will take your beloved husband. Then we will tie you to the net again while we return. They did as he had said. And soon, she and Crimson were up in the net again, trapped. Interesting, Crimson said, holding the mask on his face. What might possibly seem interesting, young lad? Asked Mrs. Layla. They are taking him to where the green light is. Wait, Crimson had the mask on. I am waiting, Layla replied with a hint of sarcasm. The green light is coming down from the tree. Layla immediately was startled. Let me see that, son. She put on the mask. Interesting indeed, she said in a soft, faint voice, almost whispering. After about 5 minutes, the green light moved again. It moved back to the top of the tall tree. And after about 15 more minutes, the legion of squirrels came back, carrying Napoleon. Let him rest, and he will wake up, said the leader squirrel. When? Layla demanded. I cannot say for sure. It might be tomorrow or in a few hours. Depends on how he reacts to the treatment, he answered. What did you do to him? She asked. That I cannot tell you, but rest assured, the forest has cared for him, he replied. Would you please stop talking in riddles and tell me what the hell is happening? Crimson cried, exasperated. The squirrel and Mrs. Layla glanced at Crimson, a bit surprised at his reaction. You will be released, and although you are free to roam the forest, I suggest you get out. We cannot afford to keep on protecting you and healing your party's wounds, said the leader squirrel. The legion of squirrels began to bring down the net and set them free. Bon voyage, said the leader squirrel and began to walk away. I know you know where the Stardust Fairy is, Crimson said. The squirrel halted immediately and slowly turned around towards Crimson. Was she the one who healed our friend? Crimson continued. Does she have the green mystical stone? The leader squirrel began grinding his teeth, looking at them with intense eyes. A few seconds later, he yelled, seize them. The other squirrels stood there, confused. No, commanded the leader squirrel. Oh no, not again, cried Mrs. Layla. The legion of squirrels then seized Crimson and Mrs. Layla and tied their hands. While this was happening, Mr. Napoleon began to wake up. Where am I? He asked faintly. Take them to the holes, instructed the squirrel. Place them in separate ones.
Eerieville-Wondrous Destiny. Chapter 13.
Crimson yelled and tried resisting all the way to the hole. Mrs. Layla was celebrating her husband's awakening, and Mr. Napoleon was too dizzy to realize what was happening. Big bad wolf. Big bad wolf, Mr. Napoleon would repeat faintly. He was just dragged by squirrel soldiers. Once inside the holes, they could not do anything but wait. Each one was in a separate one. The wooden entrance door was locked. The holes were large and deep. It seemed more like a wet, dark cave than anything. In his hole, Crimson began to shiver as the cool, moist breeze entered his lungs. It smelled like a swamp there. After about an hour of waiting, the squirrel leader came down to his hole. What do you know about the Stardust Fairy and the mystical stone? He asked. I have reasons to believe that the Stardust Fairy holds the green mystical stone and that she healed our friend with her powers, Crimson replied. How do you know of our Majesty? He asked. I knew it. You know her. Crimson spat back. I don't know her personally. The otter told us about her. The squirrel was thoughtful momentarily, then said, Wait here. Then he left. Where are you going? Crimson's unanswered voice echoed in the dark, humid walls. Crimson then waited restless for about half an hour. Then the squirrel came back. You will come with me now, he said. Where are we going? Crimson asked. If you don't shut your mouth hole, you will go to jail, he responded. Crimson gulped and widened his eyes. As he stepped outside, Crimson was blinded by the sunlight. It took a few minutes for his vision to adjust. A legion of squirrel soldiers waiting outside began to escort him. The forest trees seemed bigger as he was coming out of the hole. Where are my friends? Crimson asked. I said shut your mouth hole, snapped the leader squirrel. You'll see them soon enough. Crimson said nothing more. They continued walking for about 20 minutes, reaching the vast tree where the mask had previously signaled the green light on top. Crimson had kept his mask hidden in his vest. Wait here, instructed the leader squirrel as he went inside a hole underneath the vast tree. Mrs. Layla and Mr. Napoleon were already there, standing outside the hole. Before Crimson could ask his friends anything, the squirrel soldier leader came out, accompanied by a leopard. Mrs. Layla gasped. The leopard, who was walking upright, was wearing ragged, light brown clothes. He approached them, and Crimson could hear how the leopard purred as he analyzed him up close. After a few moments, the leopard spoke. "I am the guardian of the stone you seek, boy." Crimson opened his eyes wide open. He did not expect the leopard to be that straightforward. No need for back and forths and dancing with words, the leopard continued. "I have something you want, and you, dear boy, can give us something we want." Crimson was silent. He did not know if he should trust this talking cat. After a brief moment, he responded, "I thank you for your honesty, sir. I shall be frank as well. A few days ago, I did not know that magic was true. And now I do not know if I should trust you. The question, dear boy, is, how badly do you want this stone? And I believe we all know the answer to that. So, if you will, let us move on to the deal, shall we?" Crimson again was silent. He really was impressed with the leopard's effective words. "Very well," he responded a few moments later. "What is it that you want from us?" "What I want from you, dear boy, is that you help us bring our queen, the one you call Stardust Fairy, back to us. You see, she was kidnapped by the evil forces of Lord Darkshadow, who secretly keeps her in the castle." "I need the power of the mystical stones to save Princess Molly," Crimson replied. "She is being kept at the castle next to Lake Paladin." "The Mosquito Queen's castle," murmured the squirrels. "The what?" Crimson cried in disbelief. "Did you really say Mosquito Queen?" "You really aren't from around here, boy, are you?" asked Mrs. Layla. The leopard continued. "The castle you speak of is where the Mosquito Queen reigns. She yields her power from the diamond mystical stone, the most powerful of all. And Lord Darkshadow serves her. But he must have his own agenda. Be very wary of him." "I think I was there, and Mosquito soldiers guarded the entrance. It makes sense now. Whoever or whatever is in the castle, I really don't care. I must save my Princess Molly," Crimson said. "Then I believe we have reached an agreement," said the leopard. "We unite forces and save our ladies. The question to me now is, Mr. Crimson, how did you know where to find this emerald mystical stone?" he said as he extended his hand, revealing a green, glowing stone as it opened. Crimson did not want to answer that question. He feared that if he revealed the power of the mask, they would take it away from him. He remained silent. He was also thrilled to finally see an actual real mystical stone in front of him. "Tell them about the enchanted mask," shouted Mrs. Layla at a distance. Crimson glanced at her and locked eyes wide open with her, clearly disappointed by her interruption. "Say no more," instructed the leopard. Crimson was now confused. Why didn't the leopard want to know more about the mask? On second thought, did he know about the mask and did not want others in the forest to hear? Whatever the reason was, Crimson was glad he did not have to reveal it. This talking leopard is indeed wise, he thought. "Orion," shouted the leopard, "you and your legion will accompany Crimson on his quest. And I know it might not make sense to you now, Orion, but follow his lead. I've seen that he is a cautious one," he said, smiling while his eyes were locked on Crimson the entire time. Crimson, on the other hand, glanced back and forth between the green mystical stone on the leopard's hand and the leopard's eyes. Orion, which Crimson now realized was the name of the leader squirrel who captured them, responded affirmatively. "Eat and rest tonight, and let brave Mr. Napoleon heal completely. Tomorrow before sunrise, you will set foot on your journey. Make yourselves at home, my friends." "Oh, and Crimson, here is the emerald mystical stone," he said as he finally handed over the green stone to Crimson's hand. "Its power is to heal. With it, your friend, the brave Napoleon, was healed." He then turned back and began walking inside the hole. Crimson was ecstatic. He thought he would have to fight many difficult battles before acquiring one. "Wait," Crimson demanded. "What is your name, your majesty?" The leopard stopped and chuckled. "I am no royalty. I am but a servant who dwells in the forest, a restless spirit, eager to embrace my dear friend once more, the one you call Stardust Fairy. That is all." but you can call me an ally or simply by the name my parents gave me, Socrates. Seems to me you're the Queen's confidant, Mrs. Layla said, raising her eyebrows up and down. Socrates chuckled and went into his hole. Maybe even her boyfriend. Mrs. Layla continued giggling, but Socrates was already inside his hole, and there was no response. Crimson glanced at her and rolled his eyes.
Eerieville-Wondrous Destiny. Chapter 14.
The following morning, just before sunrise, they set afoot to seek the other mystical stones, walking through Stardust Forest. Crimson and Orion with his legion of valiant squirrel soldiers, Mrs. Layla and Mr. Napoleon. Crimson put on the mask and glanced 360 degrees around, locating the mystical stones. He saw several colors. A blue and a red one were the brightest of them all. The blue was northwest, inside the Mosquito Queen's castle, and the red one was directly north. Crimson chose the red one to avoid facing the Mosquito Guard soldiers, at least for now. He thought it best to do so after they acquired at least one more mystical stone, which would enable them with more powers. This way, he said. They began walking north. By noon, they reached the outskirts of the forest and decided to rest there. They ate some of the food they'd been carrying. Then, they continued walking towards the red light for the rest of the day, taking breaks occasionally. By sundown, they reached Rookfort Lake. Crimson put on the mask and saw a red mystical stone inside the lake underwater. "It's in there," Crimson exclaimed, pointing to the lake. "I'll get it," exclaimed Mr. Napoleon. "We're otters, after all. We're excellent swimmers." "Right," Crimson chuckled. Mr. Napoleon dove into the lake and slowly disappeared from sight. Everybody waited. Orion paced back and forth with his arms crossed in his chest, patrolling with his eyes any potential threats. Crimson did not remove his sight from the lake. There were pine trees surrounding it. The air was a bit dense and humid. 5 minutes passed by. Nothing. 10 minutes. Still no Mr. Napoleon in sight. Did he drown? Crimson asked with a worried voice. "Oh no, dear, no worries. Us otters can swim for longer than that," Mrs. Layla assured. "You can?" Crimson asked, surprised. "Oh yes, dear, no worries. He will not drown. We're expert swimmers. We thrive on water," she continued. "It's just like jogging to us." Just as Mrs. Layla explained to Crimson how well adapted otters are to water, a splashing sound came from the lake. "It's too deep," gasped Mr. Napoleon, catching his breath. "I can't reach it." "What?" Crimson asked in disbelief. "You were swimming inside the lake for at least 5 minutes. How deep can it be?" "I don't think I even got to half the distance." "That's impossible," Crimson insisted. Mrs. Layla rushed towards her husband. There was murmuring amongst the rest of the crew. "We need to ask a seal to grab it for us," Napoleon said, with his hands on his knees, spitting water and catching his breath. Everyone glanced at him with eyes wide open and a straight face. He chuckled as he saw everyone's cluelessness. Mrs. Layla smiled and said for him, "You see, seals can hold their breaths for much longer than us otters." "Uh-huh," Mr. Napoleon affirmed. After a silent pause while everyone was digesting this new piece of information, Orion voiced a logical thought. "Why would a seal help us get a mystical stone?" "We give it something in return," Mrs. Layla answered. "Obviously." "What could a seal want in return?" An unexpected voice was heard coming from one of the soldiers of Orion's legion. Everyone turned to him, surprised. There was an awkward silence for a brief moment. "Everyone likes food," Crimson broke the silence. "Exactly," Mr. Napoleon agreed. "Let's hunt then," proposed Orion. "We will get to that, surely, but realistically speaking, it is easier to find food than to find a seal," replied Mr. Napoleon. "Huh, so where do we find one?" sighed Crimson, rolling his eyes. "Most of the ones we know dwell in Lake Paladin," Mr. Napoleon informed. "Don't you ever come out to the lakes?" Still catching his breath. "That's the lake where we came from." "Where I found you," cried Crimson. "Why didn't you think of that before we came all the way here?" he demanded. How was I supposed to know that we would need a darn seal to grab a mystical stone? He shot back. As they were continuing this back and forth discussion, they heard a branch break. It was rather loud. A branch breaking from a tree nearby, some 70 feet away. That was enough to silence the conversation. Everyone glanced in the direction of the sound with eyes wide open. Some of the soldiers from the Squirrel Legion immediately ran to check it out. After about a minute, they came back with a girl. "Look what we found, Orion," one of them said to their general. He brought a girl with a mushroom hat with her hands tied behind her back and forcibly stood her before everyone in the group. "A sprite," Layla gasped as she saw her. There was murmuring amongst the group. Everyone seemed to analyze her. Some even went up close, but nobody dared to touch her. Her wings, which were almost transparent, would move back and forth instinctively, almost like an involuntary muscle. Her face was pale, almost like snow, but she had purple and magenta outlines around it and through it. Her short skirt was light green and purple. Her eyes, which were also purple, but rather a lighter pigment of purple than her skirt, opened and closed violently as she struggled to break loose. The glitter coming from the pores of her skin would fly like shining dust, creating a sort of gold and light purple aura cloud around her. The purple mushroom hat she was wearing seemed somehow attached to her head. "Let me go," she exclaimed. Commander Orion paced back and forth in front of her. He remained silent, observant with a straight face and his hands on his chin. After a moment, he then spoke. "Your kind," he paused, "is not very common. To find one of you is more rare than to witness a shooting star in the skies. I will ask this once, and I do not want any lies. Wasting my time is not very wise," he continued. "Why did we find you?" "Let me go, and I'll answer," she replied. "She looks like Princess Molly," yelled Crimson. "Do you know her?" "Princess Molly is a sprite indeed too, young Crimson. That's part of why she is so special." "You really aren't from around here, are you?" asked Layla, raising her eyebrows and scratching her head. "You do not have anything to bargain with," said Orion. "I will only ask once more." "I will put your soldiers to sleep with my pollen," warned the sprite. "Do not test my patience," Orion began to say. "Oh, you boys have no proper manners," Layla interrupted. "That's no way to treat a lady." "Allow me. You boys obviously have no education." Layla approached her. By then, the soldiers were already falling to the ground due to the pollen the sprite had begun to release from her mushroom hat. "We are truly fortunate to come upon you, dear," Layla said softly. "To what do we owe the honor of your fortunate encounter?" The remaining soldiers holding her finally let go of her as Mrs. Layla began to take over the conversation. "I want to go seek the stones with you," the sprite replied in a soft voice, looking at the soldiers around, then down like a shy little girl. "You want to come with us?" Layla was surprised. "But you already possess many powers, sweet one. Why would you want to seek the mystical stones with us?" "You don't understand. Power is not why I wish to seek them with you. It's for the thrill of adventure. It's to be able to go on a quest with new friends," she exclaimed. "Being powerful sometimes means being lonely." Mrs. Layla could even relate to her. That's kind of the same reason she embarked on the adventure herself. On the other hand, Orion was not convinced to let her come. "We cannot allow you to come with us," Orion said firmly. "It will attract too much attention, and we want to be discreet about this mission." "I have a book," she began. "A book describing the abilities of each of the mystical stones." "What?" gasped Crimson. "Each color you see on your mask is a specific stone. The book I have also has the colors of each of the stones, and it describes the abilities of each in detail." "Have you been following us?" demanded Orion. "I have," she responded candidly. "Since when?" Orion was startled. "Since he came out of the portal," she replied, glancing at Crimson. Mr. Napoleon looked at Crimson with large eyes. "Which portal?" "The one that opened in front of Her Majesty's castle," responded the sprite, her eyes locked on Crimson. "Huh, I knew you weren't from around here," exclaimed Layla. "It's a long story," Crimson said, shielding his backstory. We don't have time to waste. He's right, affirmed Orion. Although I don't know this Crimson, I trust Socrates' intuition about this young lad. We have to get going. Are you going to give us the book or not, Sprite Lady? We're not taking you with us anyhow, and if you don't give us the book, we can still search for them. My name is Icones, said the sprite, and the book I speak of signals a stone that allows you to breathe underwater indefinitely. Or you can just guess which one it is or ask a seal to do it for you, I suppose. Everyone gasped. There was murmuring. Show it to me, demanded Orion. I buried it close to here. If you give me your word that I will join your quest, I will take you to the site where it is buried, she replied. You buried it? Asked Orion. In case you seized me, which you did, her eyes piercing Orion. Orion was silent, clenching his jaw and fists, thinking, You planned on being found. You planned this whole thing. Why now? Asked Orion. Who cares? What are we waiting for? Let's go get that book, exclaimed Crimson. Orion glanced at Crimson, then approached him. He grabbed him by the throat. The only reason I will allow this is because Socrates believed in you, Sir Crimson, he whispered up close in a threatening growl. He then took a deep breath and looked at the sprite. Take us to it, please, Lady Icones.
Eerieville-Wondrous. Chapter 15.
Icones led them to a tree close by. It's buried there next to the tree, she said, pointing to a green pine-looking tree with her finger. Orion and some of his generals began to dig there. They soon hit something soft yet rigid, like a piece of cloth. The book wasn't buried that deep. That's it, exclaimed Icones. Orion lifted a book that was the color of clay. It didn't seem to be a magical book or anything. It was not very thick either. When he opened it, he could see colors and inscriptions in what seemed to be a foreign language, doodles that an 8-year-old would write. Next page, instructed Icones. Orion flipped several more pages, and he found symbols for the mystical stones, each one with a brief description beside it. It's the same, but in our language now, informed Icones. I see, sighed Orion. Let me see, exclaimed Crimson, Mr. Napoleon, and Layla as they all approached the book. So where is this underwater breathing stone? Asked Crimson, getting to the point. You gotta look for it there. Turn the pages. There's several, replied Icones. Orion, who was still holding the book, flipped several more pages, each page signaling the stone's abilities. There's more than I thought of, said Crimson, who was now next to it. Way more. The book, which was handwritten, was not very organized in its format. Some of the stones were scattered between run-on sentences. The pages looked like they had scattered colored circles separated by doodles all throughout the book. There it is, interrupted Mrs. Layla, stopping Orion's hand from turning more pages. She then pointed at a specific line in the book next to a blue stone. The sapphire stone gives its user the ability to breathe underwater indefinitely. She then read a line, like fish, you'll be able to breathe and travel deep in the waters. That's it, Crimson exclaimed. He then put on the mask and, with it, turned around, searching for a blue, shining, that matched the color of the corresponding blue hue. After a few seconds, he said, pointing east, there it is, up in those mountains. He began walking towards it. Everyone followed. Welcome to the group, Lady Icones, Orion said, smiling at Icones, still holding the book in his hands. Do not make me regret this if you'd be so kind. Off we go now, said Mrs. Layla. Sapphire Stone, here we come, exclaimed Mr. Napoleon. They all followed Crimson, who was now tying the mask strings to his face. As he walked with the mask tied to his face for the first time, he even resembled the snake wizard before he took off the mask and gave it to Crimson. Mrs. Layla felt a slight shiver as she saw Crimson go, extending his right hand up front, seemingly hypnotized by his objective, the sapphire stone. Here I go, Molly, whispered Crimson to himself. Hang on a bit more.
Eerieville-Wondrous. Chapter 16.
They walked for 2 days until they reached the other side of the valley. They crossed a lake, then a river, and finally reached the Zephyr Mountains. The mask signaled the location of the sapphire stone to be atop the mountains. Therefore, they decided to rest for the night on the mountain floor base. The environment was a mixture of desertic plains with different types of scattered trees. You could see cacti and pine trees together. The air was pretty dry, but not as dry as a complete desert. Soon, they fell asleep to the sounds of coyotes howling and the rustling sound of firewood. The following morning, Mr. Napoleon woke them up just before sunrise. "It's time to go," he yelled as he stretched his arms, then picked up his bag. Orion was the first to follow Napoleon's call, and soon they were all walking up the mountain. "We'll find some food on the way up there," Orion suggested. They hiked the mountain for about an hour, then they hunted some game. They made a quick bonfire and ate breakfast. Once their hunger was satisfied, they continued their hike. After a few hours of hiking, Crimson said with the mask on his face, "We're so close now. The blue light looks brighter than ever." He then pointed to a cave on the mountain about half a mile ahead. "It's surely inside that cave." "Is that smoke coming out of that mountain?" warned Mr. Napoleon. "It sure looks like it," Orion confirmed. "Quick," said Crimson. "Someone might have found the stone and they're resting next to a bonfire." Everyone in the party glanced at him, some frowning their eyebrows. "You think there's a bonfire in that cave?" asked Mrs. Layla. Everyone else laughed. "What? Why are you all laughing?" asked Crimson, feeling embarrassed, but not really knowing why they were laughing at him. "Boy, there is a dragon inside that cave, not a bonfire," Mr. Napoleon explained. "What?" Crimson exclaimed. "You're saying that smoke is coming from a dragon?" "It's the most likely scenario," agreed Orion. "I can't believe it," said Crimson. "I told you there were dragons here," Napoleon said. "Are you sure the sapphire stone is inside that cave?" "Let me see that," he said as he grabbed the mask from Crimson's hands. He then put the mask on his face and sighed. "It sure is there, where the dragon is. What are we to do, mighty Orion?" Orion pondered for a moment. His jaws seemed to throb a little as he clenched his molars, stressing out from having to devise a plan fast. "We need to devise a plan to draw this magnificent creature out of the cave," he finally said. "You mean magnificent beast?" Mrs. Layla remarked sarcastically. "I'll draw him out," proposed Crimson. "Valiant on your part, but impossible," Orion declined. "You're the one who have to get to the castle in one piece." He then glanced at his legion. "I need at least 2 volunteer troops. I will not force anyone to do it. If nobody volunteers, it is understandable, and I will execute this mission myself." To everyone's surprise, all the troops in Orion's legion raised their hands to volunteer. Everyone else got goosebumps seeing that. "I am honored to serve with you all," Orion said, bowing before them. He then glanced at Crimson. "Could I please ask you to give the emerald stone to my legion, in case anyone gets injured while distracting the dragon?" "Please take it," replied Crimson, grabbing it from his pocket and tossing it over to Orion. "Very well, and thank you," responded Orion as he took it. "I can be of use as well," proposed Icones. Everyone seemed to be cooperating, which raised the spirits of everyone there. Orion was so pleased, he even had to hide the lump in his throat. "No need. You must be protected as well, since your kind are precious to us," Lady Icones replied Orion. She bowed in return. Icones blushed a little and smiled. Orion gave the emerald stone to a commander in his legion and blessed them. "Hike to the east side of the cave, and we shall hike up through the west. We will wait, and as soon as the dragon is out of the cave headed towards you, we will enter the cave and grab the sapphire stone. May courage, strength, and wisdom accompany you all in this mission. I am deeply proud of you." He then glanced at Crimson and the rest. "We part now." They all did as Orion had instructed. The legion went up east, and the rest of the party west, up the mountain. Once everyone was in position, and with a clear view of the other party across the hill, Orion raised his hands to signal them to start the operation. "Now," Orion said in a low voice so that dragon wouldn't notice him. But they did see his hand gestures and understood perfectly what he meant. Orion's legion began to shout and whistle to make the dragon come out. Come out, pretty dragon! Come out! Ah, they yelled. In a few moments, a loud growl was heard from inside the cave. The mountain itself seemed to rumble. Roar! The dragon came flying out of the cave. He was larger than they had anticipated, dark orange with white and dark green stripes on his belly. He flew above the mountain. We're over here, silly dragon, the commander trooper Elias yelled. The dragon soon located them and glided down towards where they were. Let's go now, Orion exclaimed as he began to go up the cave. They all felt their hearts beat so fast while running. This was the real deal. Crimson tripped on a rock and scratched his hands while landing on the ground, hitting some rocks, but he didn't even feel pain. He stood up as if nothing had happened. Everything feels like it's going in slow motion. This might be the time that I die, Crimson thought to himself. The cave entrance was not that far from them, but Crimson felt he had been running for ages. He was so scared. He ran so fast that he was the first one to reach the cave. Once inside, he went to the corner of the cave to hide. He had even forgotten why he was there for a second or two. Where is it? Orion yelled, looking at Crimson. Crimson's eyes, while looking back at Orion, seemed lost. Where is it, Crimson? Orion asked again. We need to get out of here fast. Crimson gulped down. He started sweating more, his hands trembling while trying to make sense of it all. Give me the mask, Napoleon finally said, grabbing the mask from Crimson. Napoleon put on the mask and looked around. It's there, Mr. Napoleon exclaimed, pointing at another corner of the cave. Princess Molly. Crimson thought and finally snapped out of it. Then he stood up and sprinted towards the corner Mr. Napoleon had signaled. I got it. Crimson extended his right hand up in the air, holding the shiny blue stone. We go now, Orion yelled. What? But the dragon is outside, Crimson cried. I'll distract him. You and Mr. Napoleon go get the ruby stone. You're staying. Mr. Napoleon was shocked. I need to look after my troops, responded Orion, running out of the cave. I'll meet you at the castle. This was not part of the deal, exclaimed Mr. Napoleon. We need you by our side. Go now, before it's too late. We'll continue to distract the dragon, Orion yelled. Thank you, Mr. Orion. Crimson yelled, feeling a sense of guilty relief. Orion nodded and exited the cave. He then drew his sword out and rushed towards the dragon. Crimson was awestruck. He couldn't move. He stood there with eyes and mouth wide open, witnessing Orion sprinting towards the dragon. What are you waiting for, boy? Asked Mr. Napoleon. Let's get the hell out of here. They exited the cave and ran down the opposite direction. Crimson glanced at Orion one last time, who was just reaching his legion and the dragon. Don't look back or you'll fall down, exclaimed Mrs. Layla. They continued to run down, and soon they were at the bottom of the mountain going back for the ruby stone. Crimson paused and looked down at his right hand, which was holding the sapphire stone. A tear then came down his cheek. Mr. Orion, he whispered to himself as he wiped off his tears.
Eerieville-Wondrous Destiny. Chapter 17.
On their way back to Lake Rookfort, Crimson couldn't stop thinking about Orion and his valiant performance. He still had a lump in his throat, yet he also felt an electrical shock run from his toes to his head, which made him run through the forest faster than ever. He felt fearful no more, only inspired. After seeing Orion rush toward the dragon, death didn't seem huge to him anymore. He could face it himself too one day, he thought. He felt his heart pump to his throat, and he would wipe the sweat from his forehead, falling to his eyes. The wind would move the trees in the forest, which seemed to dance at the rhythm of their pace. After traveling by foot for an entire day, Crimson, Mr. Napoleon, Mrs. Layla, and Iconies finally reached Lake Paladin. Quick, give me the sapphire stone, said Mr. Napoleon. I'll get the stone from the lake. I can do it myself, replied Crimson, somehow feeling invincible, still with Orion in his thoughts. It will take you longer, dear, Mrs. Layla interrupted. Us otters practically live in the water. We will get there much faster. No, I will do it, Crimson firmly insisted. He then glanced at Icones. Icones, what powers will I get with the redstone? Icones quickly pulled out the book and located the redstone. Like a volcano spitting lava, thou shalt be. The ruby stone will give its user the ability to summon fire with their hands, she responded. He then put the sapphire stone in his pocket, tied the mask to his face, puffed up his chest, and dove into the lake. Have it your way, hero, Mr. Napoleon frowned, shaking his head. Crimson swam just as fast as he ran through the forest, or so he thought. He locked his eyes on the shining red stone at the bottom of the lake. Meanwhile, atop the lake, the rest of the crew waited. Icones was staring at the trees with eyes wide open. Someone is here, she said, almost intuitively. All of a sudden, they heard the trees rustling at a distance. What? Mr. Napoleon asked. It could just be a deer or a moose. It seems more like a human, she replied. How can you be so sure? Mrs. Layla whispered. I don't know how to explain it, Icones replied. It's like a gut feeling, I sense it. I think I might even smell it. We better hide, she continued. We could be kidnapped. Or worse. Thee made lunch, Mrs. Layla said. The otter couple dove into the lake to hide, and Icones climbed a tree. The rustling of trees grew louder, and now they could hear footsteps. Someone was running their way. Moments later, Icones could clearly see who it was. She was right, it was a human. Or humanish. She saw someone running towards the lake. He had yellow pale skin and cherry wine-colored hair, and was dressed in silk clothes that were colored light blue like a clear sky and khaki like a mixture of sand and clay. He was carrying a chestnut-colored bag. Before Icones could get a clear impression of him, he had reached the lake and dove into it. The ruby stone. Icones gasped as she covered her mouth with her hand and approached the lake. Mr. Napoleon, come out. A few seconds later, Mr. Napoleon and Mrs. Layla splashed out of the water they were hiding in. Was that the human that was coming from the trees? Mr. Napoleon asked, gasping for air. He dove pretty close to us. But he didn't see us, said Mrs. Layla. I think he did notice us, honey, but didn't seem to mind us, Mr. Napoleon suggested. I'm not sure he was human, Icones said. There wasn't enough time to analyze him well. What? Who or what is he? Asked Mr. Napoleon, frowning his eyebrows. I'm not sure, Icones whispered, looking at the lake. But he was carrying a small bag. I fear he is after the ruby stone. But he doesn't have the sapphire stone. No human being can breathe underwater for long without it. Is that the only stone the book says can let you breathe underwater? Asked Layla. Yes, she replied. As far as I can remember, it is. But like I said, I'm not sure he is human.
Eerieville-Wondrous Destiny. Chapter 18.
After swimming down for several minutes, Crimson was able to see the ruby stone shine brighter. It glowed in a pulsatile manner, with neon, long, bright rays extending from it. Also, dark smoke was coming out of the lake floor close to where the ruby stone was sitting, from the lake floor itself. As he saw his target clearly, a few hundred feet away, Crimson smiled from ear to ear, celebrating his achievement. Perhaps a little too soon, though. A few moments later, he saw someone swim by him faster than a shark. Crimson gasped as he saw this, and even swallowed some water unintentionally. He stopped swimming for a moment. His eyes now locked on the other swimmer. He saw his red, long hair make a wave as it flowed at an elegant, yet savage rhythm down the lake. Why is he swimming down where the ruby stone is? He feared. Could it be? Crimson began to feel his heart pound in his chest and felt a shiver run all through his body. It can't be. No. Please no. A dooming thought. Crimson swam as fast as he could down to reach the ruby stone. His legs moved so fast, but were so disorganized, out of rhythm, he couldn't even propel himself. Ironically, it made him swim rather slower than faster. Moments later, he clearly saw this individual grab the ruby stone at the bottom of the lake floor and hold it close to his face to appreciate it. He even saw how his eyes and mouth opened wide when he saw it in front of him. His eyes opened wider and larger than a regular person's would. There was a sense of innocence and honest charm to his facial expression. Crimson didn't know what to think. No, he yelled underground, making a muffled, almost silent sound. It's mine. For some reason, the individual immediately glanced at Crimson, and his facial expression changed. His eyebrows frowned. His innocent look turned menacing. Huh? How could he have heard me? Crimson thought. He is still so far away. The red-haired individual put the ruby stone in his pouch and began to swim upwards. He didn't pass close to Crimson this time, perhaps avoiding him, but Crimson was still close enough to see that the individual had small fins in his hands and feet. He could still see the shape of the hands, but somehow the fingers seemed to be connected by a thin, web-like flesh. Same with his feet. He was able to notice this because the individual was swimming slower this time. He didn't even look at Crimson as he swam upwards. He clearly didn't seem threatened by him. All of this happened too fast for Crimson to digest, who stood there, floating in deep water, with a straight face. His eyes were just locked on the individual and his pouch. Soon, the individual vanished in the light coming from the surface. Tears came out of Crimson's eyes, and immediately those tears became part of Lake Rookfort.
Eerieville-Wondrous, Chapter 19.
A splash was heard as the swimmer with the webbed hands and feet came flying out of the lake. He landed on the ground. Mr. Napoleon, Mrs. Layla, and Icones were there waiting for Crimson, but saw the red-haired, yellow-skinned guy come out instead. They all gasped. The red-haired saw them and smiled gently, confidently. He obviously felt unthreatened by them as well. The crew did not feel much threatened anymore either after seeing his innocent, charming smile. It was hard to be mad or fear a guy like that. He was more like a guy you would want to follow or join on a quest. But before they could make sense of anything, the red-haired guy ran away rapidly. Wait, Mr. Napoleon yelled to him as he disappeared amongst the trees. No response. He then glanced at Icones and Mrs. Layla. And where's Crimson? Did that guy get the ruby stone? Mrs. Layla asked. I hope not, answered Mr. Napoleon. I fear so, claimed Icones. Crimson is taking forever with this task. I'm going to go look for him, Mr. Napoleon said. Be careful, dear, said Mrs. Layla. I love you too, he replied. Mr. Napoleon jumped into the lake and swam down for several minutes. Soon, he saw a silhouette of a human swimming up. Crimson, he exclaimed as he finally was able to make out it was indeed him. He began to swim faster to his encounter. As soon as he reached him, he knew something unpleasant had occurred. The daunting look in Crimson's face said it all. Crimson made some gestures with his hand, pointing down to the bottom of the lake, and said something, but the water made it inaudible. I don't understand you, yelled Mr. Napoleon. Let's get out of the water, and then tell me. Crimson could not hear the words Mr. Napoleon was saying either, but he understood what he meant based on his hand gestures. He grabbed Crimson's hand and began to swim, pulling him upwards. He knew that, although he was an otter and could hold his breath underwater for a relatively long time, talking underwater would only take the air out of his lungs, and his body couldn't afford to do that much, or else he could faint and drown eventually. After a minute of swimming upwards, they reached the top of the lake, and Mr. Napoleon placed Crimson on the ground next to the lake. Crimson was in bad shape. He began to cry and scream. He could barely talk since he was catching his breath, choking on water, and sobbing at the same time. He sounded like a crying kid who was pushed off a bike and hurt himself really badly. Someone took the ruby stone, he said. Everyone knew what that meant and who had taken it. Their faces, who had a small hope that Crimson would have the ruby stone, fell flat. Some guy with fish hands took it. He was swimming so fast. I was almost there. Everyone there now had their faces down and were shaking them in disappointment. I should have listened to you, Mr. Napoleon. You would have beaten him. I'm so sorry. Crimson continued with a broken voice. Everyone was silent except Crimson, who was still sobbing. Please forgive me, everyone. I thought that maybe I could be a hero like Orion. He would have probably gotten the ruby stone too. I'm the only failure here. Stand up, child, said Mr. Napoleon. The quest is not over yet. There is no use in brooding for long. We don't always win here. Sometimes we lose. But that doesn't mean we stop this quest and go home. We continue trying. We continue walking towards our destination. But how are we going to rescue my princess without the ruby stone? We need its power, Crimson cried. Orion and his soldiers' efforts are in vain because of me. If they're still even alive. Orion is an expert fighter. Even though his battle against the dragon won't be easy, I believe he will be okay, Iconi said. I see you have a sword there, sir. Crimson. She pointed at Crimson's sword. Yes, Crimson replied, but I am not very good with it. Capra and Raven taught me, but I am surely no match for the evil that lies within the castle. You will not be in there alone, said Icones. You will be there fighting with you. Perhaps you think too little of yourself. I thought too good of myself when I dove in that water, but I failed to get the ruby stone, complained Crimson. I'm weak. I was born to fail all my life. Give yourself a break, kid, said Mrs. Layla. Have you ever had swimming training? No, he replied. Then how do you expect to swim faster than his otters or than that man with fish hands? But you have had training with the sword, Iconi said, encouraging her point. And I know that Capra won't train anyone who is not worth his time. You know Capra and Raven? Crimson asked while wiping off his tears. His eyes suddenly opened zestfully, a small light of hope in them. Indeed, he must have seen something in you, she said. Socrates saw something in you as well, Mr. Napoleon added. He even sent Orion and his legions to follow you. And we all know how skillful and brave Orion is. Imagine a general like him following someone he doesn't know. That must be a difficult task for him. But we're all trusting each other here. We're a team. Crimson pondered and nodded his head gently. Smiling, does that mean I am the chosen one? He finally asked sarcastically with a deviant smile. They all giggled. Whoa. I wouldn't go that far, said Mr. Napoleon, placing his hands in front of him, signaling to stop in a joking manner, smiling. They were all genuinely relieved to see Crimson in better shape. But there's something special in you, kid, said Mrs. Layla. Thanks to you, I'm with my husband on a quest. Then we ran from a dragon. We met Icones. Speaking of, I think we can stop by our house on our way to the castle. Let's go get some food. Or else it might go bad. Of course. It's pretty much on our way there. And I have a feeling there's much more to come, said Crimson as he began to stand up. He shook the dirt out of his pants. He grabbed his sword. Come, let's go there. Then let's go to the castle.
Eerieville-Wondrous Chapter 20.
Meanwhile, at the Zephyrin Mountains, Orion and his legion were having a difficult time facing the dragon. Some of his men suffered injuries, mostly cuts and swollen bruises. The dragon burned them with flames that were coming out of his mouth and scraped them with its claws. They would heal each other with the emerald stone. They continued to lash out at the dragon with swords and arrows. This is impossible, one of the soldiers cried out. I can't go on anymore. If we don't continue to fight, we will perish at the claws of the dragon. Orion yelled back. After some time battling, the dragon began to get tired and slowly backed away. That is when they were able to finally hit him with their swords. Orion's sword clashed with the scales in the dragon's skin, creating sparks upon impact. The dragon's scales on his skin were so hard it almost broke some of the swords used by the Legion. It also bent some of them. Finally, one of the swings from Orion's sword was aimed underneath one of the scales, and it pierced the dragon's skin. Shriek, cried the dragon. Aim your swords to hit it under the scales. Orion yelled. A war cry from the Legion. They followed this technique from then on. It's bleeding, one of the soldiers cried. Another war cry from the Legion. After several more minutes of attacking the dragon finally fell to the ground, making a loud thumping sound. The ground trembled. Some of the soldiers even fell to the ground as the trembling of the earth caused them to lose their balance. The dragon appeared to be exhausted. He didn't seem to have intentions of standing back up. It was focused on catching its breath and protecting itself. Yeah, the Legion jumped up and down, raising their hands and smiling in celebration. Let's stop the attack, commanded Orion. What? We finally got him. What do you mean? Asked one of the soldiers. We rest. We catch our breath. Then we shall see, Orion replied. The dragon, too, was preoccupied with catching its breath and attending to its wounds. It licked its bleeding wounds with its large, coarse tongue. Smoke even came out of its mouth unintentionally as he did this. After a few minutes, Orion said, "Eat some food, drink water. In a few minutes, we will heal the dragon with the emerald stone." What? He will surely attack us, my liege. One of the soldiers questioned his commander's order. It is a risk we have to take, he replied. That's why we need to eat and drink, to gather our strength when he does this. But we don't have anything against this dragon. He has done us no wrong. No wrong, another soldier asked. He has literally been injuring us all this time. That was not his fault. He was just defending himself and his territory. It was our plan, to begin with, to give Crimson time to get the Sapphire Stone. It is our duty to deal with it now. I intend to gain its trust. He then looked around. Who has the Emerald Stone? Sire, replied one of the soldiers, standing up and holding it above his head. Hand it to me now, Orion said. My liege, he responded while he approached Orion and handed it to him. Orion then meticulously approached the dragon, looking it in the eye while he walked. The dragon's eyes seemed weakened and were watery. It breathed heavily, letting out some smoke from his mouth. I know you are exhausted, friend, said Orion while bowing his head. So are we, he went on. We do not wish to fight you anymore. Orion then held the emerald stone in front of his face so that the dragon could see it clearly. Then he slowly rubbed it on one of his injuries. The round emerald stone glowed in a throbbing manner, almost as if being awakened or activated. The dragon saw how his scales stopped bleeding. Its eyes widened with astonishment. His breathing relaxed. After a short moment, Orion proceeded to rub the emerald stone on another injury. It also healed instantly. The dragon sighed and smiled with relief. Orion then slowly proceeded to heal the rest of the wounds the dragon had. After a few minutes, the dragon was fully healed. Roar! The dragon stood up and blew some flames into the sky out of his mouth. It then looked at Orion with sharp, bright eyes. Orion gulped and slowly backed away cautiously, not removing his eyes from the dragon. The dragon then looked at the emerald stone, which was still in Orion's hand, and began approaching him. Orion could see its intentions and began to run away. The dragon quickly caught up to him and grabbed him with its sharp claws, just like an eagle grabs its prey. No! Orion cried out and quickly tossed the emerald stone to another soldier. The dragon saw this and immediately let go of Orion. Ah! Orion hit a rock as he fell and hurt his right hip. The dragon glided towards the soldier who now had the emerald stone. The soldier widened his eyes and mouth with terror. Run! One of the soldiers yelled. It took a second for the soldier with the emerald stone to move. He couldn't move his legs. He was in shock, paralyzed. Move now, yelled Orion. The soldier finally came to his senses and turned away to start running. It was too late. The dragon had a hold of him now. Toss me the emerald stone, yelled Orion. The soldier threw the stone to Orion but missed. It landed on the ground. Orion quickly grabbed it but tripped as he crouched to get it. The dragon, who saw Orion grab the emerald stone, sprinted towards Orion. But just before the dragon got to him, he let out a sharp cry. Shriek! Another soldier had pierced him in the tail. No, yelled Orion. He then tossed the emerald stone to another soldier, the one that was farthest to the dragon. Another soldier cried as he threw himself towards the dragon. With his sword, he pierced its chest. The dragon let out another shriek. The rest of the soldiers drew their swords and charged towards the dragon surrounding him. "That's what you get, you nasty dragon," said one of the soldiers as he stepped on the dragon's face while it was on the floor. The dragon let out a tear. The legion celebrated. "What now?" asked one of the generals. "We heal it again," replied Orion firmly, catching his breath. "This is madness," murmured the soldiers. "Insanity." "There is a defeated look in his eyes," Orion said. "His soul has been crushed this time. I have a feeling this time he will not react the same way." "I have a bad feeling about this," said one of the soldiers from afar. "But here's the emerald stone, my liege." He tossed the emerald stone to Orion. Orion began to heal the dragon's wounds with the emerald stone once more. Once the dragon was fully healed, it stood up. Orion faced him, his chest puffed out. To everyone's surprise, the dragon bowed its head a little in front of Orion. It then grabbed Orion with its claws and took off holding him. The emerald stone was still on Orion's hands.
Eerieville-Wondrous Destiny. Chapter 21.
This time, the dragon squeezed Orion's arms while it grabbed him, which prevented him from throwing the emerald stone to his soldiers like he had done last time. "Master, Commander," Orion heard the voices from his comrades fade in the air slowly as the dragon carried him gaining elevation. Orion frowned and sighed. How could I have been naive about the dragon's intentions? He thought. This would only prevent him from getting to Crimson's aid sooner. After a few minutes, they were flying above the clouds. He felt a shiver and his skin got goosebumps. He thought of the mission, how to escape, and of his beautiful home forest, which ultimately he was there to save. He took a deep breath and opened his mouth and eyes wide in amazement. The flight somehow felt to him as if it flourished his very essence. He saw the rivers, the lakes, the forest, hills, and mountains from above. He even saw the Mosquito Queen's castle sitting at the bottom of the austere mountains, next to a dark, muddy swamp. He saw the snow on top of the mountains, then the migrations of herds of animals. Although Orion feared for his life, the cool air and seeing all the land from a high altitude gave him a sense of peace and surrender. He even wondered if that's the kind of peace one would feel just before greeting death. He didn't want to dwell too much on that thought, though. Surrendering was not in his nature. After a while, they reached a shore next to the Lucullan Sea. Then they finally reached the seas that lead nowhere. They flew above an endless ocean for about an hour, and he finally saw land once more. An island. In it, they arrived at another range of mountains. These were higher and more steep than the Zephyr and austere mountains. What is this land? Orion thought to himself. He had not seen past the seas that lead nowhere before, where the dragon was taking him with its own claws. Actually, nobody he knew of had any idea of what lies beyond them. He was being taken captive to an uncharted, unmapped world. But now, he was landing on a large mountain range on an island there. He saw dragons flying around them. Orion assumed there, and then that he was going to be dragon supper in a few moments. Too bad this trip was going to end soon for him, he thought. He even felt like a failure, and a sense of hopelessness began crawling up his body, like thorny vines latching onto him. But at least he saw what lies beyond the seas that lead nowhere now, he thought. A small window of light in his last moments. The dragon made its entrance to a cave located high up in the mountain range, while still holding Orion with its claws. He finally let go of him, and Orion stumbled to the ground. His legs and right arm were numb due to the dragon's grip. The dragon's grip was not tight, just firm, but the claws were pointy and sharp. By now, Orion was bleeding a little due to the sharp claws that held him for such a long time. He had flailed violently in an attempt to escape. As he began to stand up and gain his balance, Orion saw, to his amazement, baby dragons inside that cave. The thick, dense, and yellowish yolk was still fresh dripping from some of the large eggs that had cracked. Crimson himself, who was taller than Orion, would easily fit inside one of those large, dripping eggs, given the right position. He then heard a deep, weakened croaking cry of a dragon. He glanced to the corner of the cave where the sound came from. Orion then saw, to his amazement, a large dragon lying on the floor. It looked just the same as the dragon who brought him there. Orange with thick, sharp piercing scales. Just slightly smaller and slimmer. Ah! Orion cried with a broken voice, losing his balance a little due to the shock of what he was seeing. He then tried to escape the cave. The cave entrance was larger, enough for the cave to be illuminated. But the dragon who brought him blocked the entrance, preventing his exit. It then pointed with its head towards the dragon that was laying on the floor, signaling Orion in that direction. Orion stood still. He soon realized he had no escape and that he was about to be eaten by the dragon laying in the corner. The dragon then bowed at Orion and signaled with its mouth once more to the corner of the cave where the other dragon was lying on the ground. Orion, who was not expecting that bow from the dragon, raised his eyebrow and glanced towards that direction, feeling a light sense of relief. I'm glad these dragons aren't cruel beasts. They're just hungry, he thought. He took a deep breath and slowly began to walk that way. He felt his heart pump faster as he approached, ready to draw his sword in a final attempt to stay alive. Just before getting to the large dragon lying on the floor, he stopped, took a deep breath, and walked his final steps towards it. Once Orion was in front of that dragon, he noticed how the dragon was breathing heavily, with difficulty. There were long pauses between breaths, and it would move its chest when it inhaled. It seemed to be under stress and pain. It seemed weakened. He then saw blood on the floor all around the dragon. Orion gasped. He then glanced back at the dragon that took him there. The dragon again pointed its head towards the large dragon. Orion stood there, frowning his face, confused. He then began pacing back and forth next to the dragon. A few moments later, he understood what the dragon wanted. You want me to heal your dragon friend, he exclaimed with relief and a smile on his face. He then quickly took out the emerald stone. Orion did not know yet where the dragon's injury was, so he had to look for it. He walked around the dragon, but couldn't see where the injury was. He then saw an uncracked egg that was close to the dragon, and it had blood on it as well. Your mama dragon, he gasped. It finally all made sense to Orion. Why the dragon brought him to this cave, and why the dragon wanted the emerald stone. The dragon saw its power while they were battling him, and now wanted to heal whom was possibly his very own dragon mate, who had just laid the eggs of his very own offspring. After looking at the blood-stained egg, Orion now understood where the injury might be. He got close to the mama dragon's bottom and placed the emerald stone there. He left it there. A few minutes later, the mama dragon's eyes widened and it stood up. She was completely healed. The first thing she did was to quickly rush towards her eggs and baby dragons and begin to nurse them.
Eerieville-Wondrous. Chapter 22.
Orion understood perfectly now what was going on. It was obvious to him. The mother dragon had been losing blood after laying its eggs. It was, after all, a numerous dragon egg litter. Most of the eggs were unhatched, but there were other groups of hatched eggs in that same cave. White, yellowish eggs with gray spots on the top and bottom and a few green spots here and there. Orion wondered if all those eggs were from the same mother dragon or if that cave was shared by a group of dragon mothers. Maybe the entire mountain is a birthplace for dragons, he pondered. He went outside the cave to catch some fresh air. Once out, he saw dragons flying all around. He hadn't really noticed them when they had entered the cave. There were dragons of all sizes there. Large, medium, and even small infant dragons. Most dragons were dark orange with red spots, but there were a few dark gray and a couple of white ones. All of them seemed to have red spots, especially in the chest and belly area. He even saw how baby dragons were trying to fly. He saw them lift off, fall, stand back up, and try again. They gave a soft cry as they hit the rocks when they fell. It must be the birthplace of dragons, he concluded. Orion's eyes were wide open. The fog in the mountain and the high altitude, the blood stains from the dragon mother on his hands, all of that made him feel lightheaded. He felt like he was about to lose his balance and fall. He even felt like throwing up a little. Moments later, his dragon friend came out of the cave. Roar! It roared right beside Orion. Orion now fell to the ground and threw up. That roar did it for him. Soon, a dozen dragons landed in front of them. Orion was petrified but managed to remain as calm as he could. The female dragon that was just healed came out of the cave as well and roared next to him. The other dragons, seeing her now healed, bowed. Is she the dragon leader here? Orion wondered. Right afterward, the dragon that brought him there bumped Orion on the butt with its nose, and Orion went flying, spinning into the air. This is it, the legendary squirrel warrior thought to himself. It's lunchtime for the dragons, and I'm the main dish. At least I know I did well and probably will be going to heaven, he thought, surrendered as he felt a warm cloud of darkness embrace him. But then his dragon friend bumped him into the air and caught Orion on its back. It was the dragon's breath he was feeling. The dragon then began to fly towards the seas. At least a dozen other dragons followed them. After about 5 minutes of flight, Orion recognized the way. They were flying back to the Zephyr Mountains. After about an hour of flight, they arrived there. Orion's crew was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps they saw the dragons and took refuge, Orion concluded. Once they landed, Orion stepped out of this dragon friend and stepped on the soil. Special Legion Forces of Stardust Forest, show yourselves. Orion yelled. This is Commander Orion. Report for duty. The Legion then slowly came out of their hiding spots. Most of them were inside the cave, but others were hiding behind the bushes or underneath holes. The look on their faces when they saw their commander standing in front of a dozen dragons was priceless. Their eyes were wide open. Some of them even trembled as they walked, and a few stumbled and tripped, landing on the ground. Is it really you, Commander? Asked one of his generals with a shaky, stuttering voice. He was a few meters from him now. It is I. It is us, Orion responded with a firm voice. Behold our new allies, my mighty and able Legion of the Woods. Crimson and company have no idea what is coming their way. Orion's dragon friend let out a roar. Some of the soldiers fell to the ground, shocked by its loudness. Orion chuckled. Ah! Orion gave a war cry roar. Roar! The dragons followed. Ah! The entire Forest Legion gave out a war cry. It was surreal. Earlier that day, they feared for their lives, battling a mighty dragon for hours. Now, they had a whole legion of mighty dragons before them, standing as allies. Brace yourselves to the dragons. Orion commanded. Off we go. The entire legion was soon riding dragons up in the air, breathing the euphoria as they moved through the clouds. Orion's dragon friend let out another roar. The other dragons roared. The entire Legion of the Woods gave out a war cry with all their strength, but it was not nearly as loud as the dragons. The dragon smiled. With his right hand, Orion signaled to his dragon friend the direction of the austere mountains. To the castle, he yelled yet another war cry. His dragon friend began flying in that direction, and the rest of the Legion of the Woods followed.
1%. Chapter 23.
Crimson and company ran all the way to the castle, passing through trees, hearing a swoosh as their faces broke the winds in front of them. By sundown, they reached the outskirts of the castle. There was a thick forest surrounding the castle. A lake feeding from a river and some plains separated the forest from the castle. The air was thick and humid, and the lake was swampy. The trees were large. Different types of trees make up the forest, with different types of leaves. Some were taller, some were shorter. Some were umbrella-like, some thin, and some were just typical pine trees. Some were shades of purple, some were shades of blue, and some were shades of green. There were all types of insects and animals. Just before they reached the bridge to the castle's entrance, Iconi stopped. This is as far as I can accompany you, dear friends, she said. What? You're not coming, cried Crimson. It is not for the likes of me to partake in the world of political affairs, she replied. Political affairs? Asked Crimson. We're trying to save Princess Molly. You will do a great job, I'm sure, she said. I thank you for allowing me to join your party. As a token of my appreciation, I will give you one last piece of advice. There is a map inside the castle. Just like the Book of the Mystical Stones, it shows the location of important and valuable items within the castle. It also identifies the chambers within. Your Princess Molly, most likely, will be in the dungeons underneath. Once you finish thine quest, and if you survive, come outside again, I will meet you here. Best of luck. There's no way we can do this alone without you, Crimson demanded. Where is this nonsense coming from? Are you upset? Who said you were alone? She asked. I am not upset. I just can't get involved. But very well then, I will only accompany you then. No fighting for my part. Gee, thanks, he replied. You're already involved. But I haven't fought against Her Majesty yet, said Icones. Is she your friend? Asked Crimson. Why do you call her Her Majesty? With so much respect. She is not my enemy, she said with a firm, yet soft voice. We should have trusted Orion's intuition about the sprite, Mr. Napoleon muttered, disappointed. We wouldn't have gotten the sapphire stone if it wasn't for her, responded Mrs. Layla. We didn't even need it. We didn't get the ruby stone. Are you a spy, sprite? Asked Mr. Napoleon. No, Icones exclaimed. Crimson, Mr. Napoleon, and Mrs. Layla were speechless. They were shocked by her abrupt, sudden, and cold change. They had failed in getting the ruby stone, and Orion's whereabouts were unknown. They didn't even know if he and his legion were alive. She was their only hope in terms of power and magic. You're afraid of her. You're afraid of the Mosquito Queen. Crimson concluded. Icones looked down. After a short pause, she talked. It's just that, she began to explain. I can't. I'm so sorry. Or rather, I can, but I choose not to. There is an antique custom that we magical creatures live by. Non-interference with the world. We belong to nature, not to the world. We can help if someone is hurt, but nothing more. We are not supposed to hurt anyone, much less for the interests of those in political power. That would just create more chaos. All of a sudden, they saw a silhouette eclipsing the moon. It was a fleet of dragons flying. They all gasped. Look, said Mrs. Layla. Some of those dragons look like the one we saw up in the mountains. No, cried Crimson. They ate Orion and his legion, he assumed. Inside the castle gates, they were also startled. Tell Lord Darkshadow there is a fleet of dragons close by, yelled one of the guards. Lord Darkshadow, who was inside the castle, was notified of the dragon. He stepped outside the chamber he was in and began walking through a corridor inside the castle. Commander Fiamma, are these some of your dragons? Yelled Lord Darkshadow as he walked. Footsteps approached rapidly. Soon, the human-like being with the face of a dragon met Lord Darkshadow in the corridor. Sire, Commander Fiamma asked. I was just notified about a fleet of dragons flying on the outskirts of the castle. Is it one of yours? Asked Lord Darkshadow again. I could only say for sure if I see it, replied Commander Fiamma. Let us go see it then, instructed Lord Darkshadow. They walked to the castle gate and saw the fleet of dragons. By that time, the dragons were landing where Crimson and company were at. They were behind some trees a few hundred yards from the castle gates. Quick, hide! Mr. Napoleon exclaimed. They're going to eat us. They all began to climb up a tree terrified. Sir Crimson, exclaimed Orion, who was beginning to come off the dragon. Crimson was confused. He recognized Orion's voice, but he was hiding from the dragons. He didn't even want to look at them. I think our time has come, my friends. I hear the voice of Orion's ghost calling unto me, said Crimson. Don't be foolish, Crimson, said Orion. I am not dead. I'm here with the dragons. Orion, exclaimed Crimson as he finally glanced towards him. You're with the dragons? How could this be? I can't believe what I'm seeing. Soon, even more dragons reached the spot. With the emerald stone, we healed some of this dragon's friends that were injured, replied Orion. As a token of gratitude, they will help us now. Is that true? exclaimed Crimson, raising his hands. There is more power in friendship, in providing service to others, than there is in the mystical stones, said Icones. A valuable lesson you have learned today, dear Crimson. Crimson shed a tear of happiness as he witnessed this. Meanwhile, voices were heard at a distance from the castle gate. These are not my dragons, sire, affirmed Commander Fiamma. Get the army ready, shouted Lord Darkshadow. Fiamma went inside to summon his forces. There was a lot of commotion at the castle gate. They were assembling the army. Crimson drew his sword and began walking towards the castle. It is time, he said. Orion's army followed. Icones stopped Crimson. One more thing. Dear, beware of Lord Darkshadow. Never make the mistake of underestimating him. Although he is a powerful sorcerer and magician, his greatest power is his tongue and his mind. Now go, win, and come back. I will await you. Why can he fight and you can't? Crimson asked. It is his choice, responded Icones. Crimson and Orion's forces continued to charge towards the castle. They stopped and glanced at each other. For Socrates, Orion said. For Princess Molly, Crimson replied. For our Stardust Fairy Queen, said Mr. Napoleon. For love, said Mrs. Layla. For a wondrous destiny, whispered Icones from a distance. Best of luck. Crimson raised his sword, let out a war cry, and dashed towards the castle. Attack, yelled Orion, commanding his forces.
Wondrous Chapter 24.
The forces charged towards the gate, making a cloud of dust as they ran. Orion and his legion jumped on their dragons and began to take off, flying. We're being attacked, said one of the castle guard soldiers as he witnessed this. Meanwhile, Lord Darkshadow and Commander Fiamma were still gathering their forces. Crimson was the first one to reach the gate. He pounded the large wooden door with his sword. Wood crackled and chips of wood and splinters would fly off. Sparks would also fly when he hit the metal bars holding the door instead of the wood. Orion, on the other hand, and two other of his soldiers riding dragons were able to fly above the entrance door, but were met by Lord Darkshadow. Not so fast there, pretty squirrel, said Lord Darkshadow as he began to charge up a cloud of dark smoke magic spell with his hands. I will willingly admit, nonetheless, I was not expecting to be attacked by a legion of squirrels riding dragons. Ha ha ha. Thank you for making my day a little less boring. Ha 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 ha. I'll show you what we've got. Orion yelled back. Ha ha ha. No, you won't, said Lord Darkshadow in a high-pitched giggle and a smirk on his face. Lord Darkshadow propelled the cloud of dark magic towards Orion, which blinded him and the dragon he was riding. He was forced to retreat to the outskirts of the castle once more. Bring the sages out here, yelled Lord Darkshadow. Aye, sir, responded one of the mosquito soldiers inside the castle walls. Crimson, Mr. Napoleon, and Mrs. Layla meanwhile were at the gate door still trying to bring it down. Although the wood of the door slowly chipped away at the swing of their swords, it was taking too much time and the Mosquito Queen's army was quickly assembling inside the gate. They could even hear the mosquito soldiers buzzing and others thumping their feet behind the door. We need to find another solution, said Mr. Napoleon. This won't work. We're largely outnumbered. What? Cried Crimson, who put his hands on his knees to catch his breath. I don't know, but 3 of us won't beat that army even if we do bring down the door, replied Napoleon. Then we ride dragons, said Crimson. That's a better idea, replied Mr. Napoleon. I fear a great unknown power in that castle, said Mrs. Layla, shivering. What do you mean, dear? Asked Napoleon. There's something very eerie and rotten in there, I feel it. I don't think any of us know about the real and evil powers there, she said. Crimson and Mr. Napoleon glanced at each other. We should save our strength, boy, proposed Mr. Napoleon. Ah, Crimson yelled in frustration and continued to bang the immense wooden door with his sword. Battle is not only about strength, dear boy. It's also about intelligence and tactics, said Mr. Napoleon in a soft and gentle voice while he put his hand on Crimson's shoulder. The thumping and buzzing sounds made by the army assembling inside became louder. Meanwhile, Orion, who was propelled out of the castle by Lord Darkshadow's dark thundercloud, was hovering, riding the dragon, and thinking of what to do from a safe distance from the castle. He was also simultaneously analyzing what was going on inside the castle gate. Sages, wearing white and other colored cloaks, began to appear before Lord Darkshadow inside the castle walls. "What do you need?" Lord Darkshadow asked one of the sages as he arrived at the spot. "What do I need?" "In case you haven't noticed, Sage, we are being attacked by a legion of dragons," he replied. "I thought this was merely one of Commander Fiamma's exercises with his dragon forces," the sage replied with his high-pitched, broken voice. "If this was one of Fiamma's training exercises, I wouldn't be here," exclaimed Lord Darkshadow. "But I already asked him, and he said that these are not his dragons." He continued as he pointed to Orion and his legion flying at the other side of the castle gate. "I see," said the sage. "Nothing that we cannot handle." "I know," said Lord Darkshadow. "We will think of what to do with these dragons. We do not wish to kill them. They are too valuable. They can be trained by Fiamma to be of use to the queen, and we wish to know where they come from as well. They might be more dragons there. So while me and Commander Fiamma think of what to do, we will shield the castle with a protective spell. That's why I summoned you and the other sages." "Uh-huh," exclaimed the sage, seeing the logic and wisdom behind Lord Darkshadow's plan. "Very well. Now let us make a circle. Sages, come forth unto me," instructed Lord Darkshadow. "We will administer a protective shield spell upon our Majesty's castle." "Aye, aye," the other sages exclaimed in high-pitched, raspy voices. Lord Darkshadow grabbed 2 mosquito soldiers. "You will be spies," he said. "Go to the back of the castle and hide. You will tell me anything that you see outside." The mosquito soldiers nodded. "Go now. You have but a few minutes," exclaimed Lord Darkshadow. Brian, who was seeing all this, understood something was being planned. Something not favorable for them. He then heard Crimson's sword clashing with the wooden gate's metal bars. "Crimson!" he exclaimed. "Get away from there." Crimson nor Mr. Napoleon nor Mrs. Layla could hear Orion. They could only hear Crimson's sword hitting the door and the sounds of the Mosquito Queen's army inside the gate. Orion decided he should go to them. "Crimson," he said as he descended, "you all need to get away from here. Sages are planning something. They might throw a fireball or something close to here. We need to protect ourselves and plan a strategy." "I can do this," yelled Crimson. "I know you can," said Mr. Napoleon. "But that will get you nowhere but killed or made prisoner." "Quick, Crimson," pleaded Orion. "We need to get away from here." "No," cried Crimson. "We're close. I have to save Princess Molly. I've come so far." Inside the castle gate, the sages assembled themselves in a circle. "We're ready to administer the spell, Lord Darkshadow," the sage said. Lord Darkshadow took one last glance outside the castle, and he then saw that the spy soldiers were at the outside of the gate, already in the back of the castle. "Commence," he said. The sages then grabbed each other's hands. "Avidin me Nudamark." The sages began to chant. "Avidin me Nudamark." They chanted this 6 more times. A plasma, white and bluish translucent sphere began to appear in the middle of their circle. Thunder and lightning bolts came from that sphere. Strong winds lifted the capes and moved the cloaks and robes of the sages. They kept on chanting, and the sphere grew larger and larger. It became so large that it encapsulated the entire castle. Crimson, who was outside the gate, felt a shock run through his body as his sword hit the plasma ball, which was already also in the gate itself. He cried and fell to the ground. Orion flew towards them at full speed. He lifted him and placed him, Mr. Napoleon, and Mrs. Layla on the dragon's back. The dragon flew away, taking all of them several yards away, to the trees. The sphere grew bigger, and by now the entire castle structure was about a meter inside the plasma ball. The clear plasma ball was still white, but you could see through it, and in it now radiated rainbow neon-colored lightning. Mr. Napoleon threw a rock at it, and the rock burned on impact, making sparks and lightning before it disintegrated. "You're gonna get yourself killed, boy," he then yelled at Crimson. "Or one of us. Would you just let go of your ego and think for once?" Crimson was silent. He had never seen Mr. Napoleon that upset before. Even Orion had a straight face and was silent. Crimson knew that Mr. Napoleon was right. This quest wasn't about himself. He could now see his vanity in this. He now felt that he was sabotaging the operation. Crimson couldn't even hold his sword anymore. His hands were burnt from the plasma impact with the sword. There was silence. Crimson lowered his face and said nothing. He felt too ashamed to apologize again. He deserved to be yelled at, he concluded. "We need magic," Orion said, breaking the silence. "Only a spell can break a spell." "Or a huge amount of force and power," said Mr. Napoleon. "Icones," exclaimed Mrs. Layla. "What of her?" asked Orion. "She has to know who can do magic," she said. "How do you know?" asked Orion. "She knows Capra and Raven," said Crimson, finally speaking. "Icones," yelled Crimson. "Where are you?" "I'm right here," Icones responded, undisturbed. "Ah," Mr. Napoleon exclaimed. "You scared me." She was atop a tree, just several meters away from them. Icones giggled. "You're right. Capra and Raven know magic," she said. "Great. Who else does?" asked Orion. "We need as many people as possible." "I do," she said, smiling. "We know you do. But you won't fight for us," exclaimed Mr. Napoleon. "It is not my place to get involved in the politics of the world," she said. "What politics?" asked Orion. "Your friends are in battle. They need your help. You're the one who asked to join us." Crimson rolled his eyes. "I wanted to make new friends," she replied, "and this battle is more political than you're aware of." "How so?" asked Crimson. "Orion, would you care to explain why, or should I?" she asked. Everyone glanced at Orion with an intense look. Their eyes, wide open, locked on him. Orion took a deep breath. "The Mosquito Queen," he began, "as we all know, has total control over most of this world." "I would say all of it," said Mrs. Layla. "With the Diamond Stone, she controls lightning at her will. Nobody can beat that power. Her ambitions now are to expand her empire by breeding new mosquitoes. Her sage priests go kidnap creatures all over the land to feed her offspring," said Orion. "She needs our blood to thrive," said Mrs. Layla. "Indeed," said Icones. "In decades, many have tried to bring her down, but all have failed. Their blood becomes supper," continued Orion. "But there is a force more powerful than fear," said Layla. "Indeed," said Icones. "Which is?" asked Crimson. "True love," replied Icones. "Love is more powerful than fear or death even." "Wow! So," said Crimson, "because we're friends and we love each other, that means we are more powerful?" "Close," replied Orion. "But we're referring to a different type of love. Romantic love. And you, Sir Crimson, are in love with Princess Molly." "I see," said Crimson. "I am the chosen one." He giggled at his own sense of humor. The others smiled. "Close," said Mr. Napoleon. "But you're still flesh and you still bleed. You're not invincible. Nobody is." "There is something you need to know, Sir Crimson," said Orion. "What is it?" he replied. "Princess Molly, if the rumors are true, might be engaged to someone else," said Orion. Crimson widened his eyes and looked away, hiding his face. He didn't know how to react. He was embarrassed. He felt the heat of blood blushing to his face. He felt like a fool for believing he had a chance of being with her. He didn't want anyone to see his watery eyes. "Why did you tell him, Orion?" whispered Mr. Napoleon. "He will abort the mission and abandon us. We were more close than ever to beating the evil queen." "At last," Icones said. "Some truth here." "You all knew about this?" cried Crimson. There was silence. Everyone was now facing down, avoiding Crimson's eyes. How could you, Mr. Perfect, yelled Crimson, looking at Mr. Napoleon. You are all using me. I hate all of you. Crimson threw down his sword and began to run away. You see, said Mr. Napoleon. I told you he would leave. It had to be done, said Icones. I'm proud of you, Orion. Orion said nothing but looked down. But you still won't help us, he said. I will go talk to him. Then we shall see, she replied.
Eerieville-Wondrous. Chapter 25.
Icones found Crimson sitting down, still crying. She just watched him from afar. She waited patiently for him to have his own time dealing with this. After about an hour, Crimson got up to set a fire. Icones then approached him. Crimson, she began. Your path is not an easy one, but you must make a choice. I feel betrayed, he replied. I feel used. That ironically hurts me more than the fact that my Princess Molly is engaged to someone else. That's what makes you wonderful, she replied. You have everything against you. And she still is not married. Everything is possible. But you must know another truth. This land needs you. The forest needs you. The creatures of this world need you. Believe in us. Believe in your love. Believe in our destiny. We're all tired of being afraid of the Mosquito Queen. One final truth I shall speak. Whatever it is you decide to do, I will respect you, and I will still consider you my friend nonetheless. Thank you for being here, Icones, said Crimson. I've been here for about an hour, Icones said, smiling. You stalker, Crimson replied. They both giggled. Crimson then remained silent for a moment and pondered. I love you, Icones. You have shown to be a true friend, he said. And Princess Molly, even though she might not love me back, still needs help. I will go and fight for all of us. He then stood up, grabbed his sword, and began walking back to battle camp. Unrequited, selfless love, Icones whispered as she saw him walk away. She then smiled and had a firm look on her face. Suddenly, a caterpillar crawled up her hand. She looked at it and whispered, It's happening.
Wondrous. Chapter 26.
Crimson arrived at camp soon. Crimson, I'm so glad you're back. I'm so sorry I didn't tell you the truth before, cried Napoleon. It's okay, my friend. Nobody is perfect. I learned that from you, he replied and smiled. I'm glad you're back, lad, said Orion. Where's Icones? She was right behind me, Crimson said. She'll probably catch up. I'm not sure she will, said Mr. Napoleon. She's so unpredictable and unreliable. With or without her, we go into battle, said Crimson with a firm tone. I don't have time to wait to be saved. We fight with what we have. You have your dragons. I have my sword. I just need to eat first. Everyone there felt a shiver. Even though Crimson's tone was calm and his tone serene, there was a determination in him, and everyone knew he would go at it alone if he needed to. Are you out of your mind? Asked Mr. Napoleon. We will never. Let's eat. Orion interrupted. He was just glad that eating would buy them some time before Crimson did something outrageous. They made a bonfire and began eating.
Wondrous. Chapter 27.
Icones had gone to Capra and Raven without letting anyone know. She secretly opened a portal that took her to Capra's place, the same place where Crimson was with the masked maidens. Raven was there as well. The portal was yellow, but it radiated bright neon colors and sparks. Purple, blue, orange, and red. Inside the portal was a dark center point that seemed to be the vacuum. My, said Capra as he saw Icones portal in. To what do I owe the pleasure and the honor? Capra was at his estate, washing clothes by hand on a mud brick table, which was reinforced with a concrete and lime slab at the top. We need to help Crimson, she cried unto them. I thought you didn't get involved in politics, Icones, replied Capra smiling, still attending to his chores. He unintentionally splashed some gray water that stained his white robes a little. Sometimes you get curveballs and life makes you do the things you really don't like to do. It's how we can grow, she shot back. Like my chores? Asked Capra with a smile. It's called getting out of your comfort zone, Icones, said Raven. Very well. It might be, she said, now glancing at Raven. Will you then get out of your comfort zone and help us? You mean to tell us that you're fighting in this battle? Asked Capra. I don't recall you ever getting involved in anything of the sort. I never thought I had a reason to before, she replied. There was a short silence. You're in love with Crimson, said Raven, bullying her a little, breaking the silence. What? No, I don't think so, she cried. You must be, look at you, going into battle for a good enough reason, said Raven. It's okay, my friend. We don't always choose who we fall in love with, said Capra, smiling, following Raven's lead, finding amusement in provoking her old friend. I don't have time to think of this now, exclaimed Icones. We need to help them. She is in love, Raven said, giggling. Crimson knows the truth about Princess Molly. For some reason, everyone here was avoiding telling him the truth, she said. She isn't married yet, said Raven. Maybe she will have a change of heart and marry the boy. What a lame excuse for not telling him, exclaimed Icones. Are you in love with Icones, Raven? Asked Capra, giggling, now bullying him. Shut up, Capra, yelled Raven. Are you saying I'm ugly? Asked Icones. No, said Raven. I was just. Got you back. Icones snapped, laughing for a second. Her face then turned serious once more. Will you help us though? Please? Of course we will, dear friend, said Capra. I think Crimson is almost ready. What do you mean? You were testing him all this time? Asked Icones. Of course we were going to join him and help him. He just had to face some things on his own to grow stronger. And look, now he even has you involved. It even surprises me. I don't know what to say to that, said Icones. You don't have to. Let us go now, said Capra. He then hung the rinsed clothes on clotheslines. Thank you, said Icones. Capra then glanced towards his house. I'll be back later, he yelled. Okay, be safe. Some female voices were heard from inside. Raven opened up a portal and all three went inside.
Wondrous Destiny. Chapter 28.
Crimson and company were eating some meat they had cooked at the bonfire. Well into the forest, a few hundred feet from the castle gate. So, are you going to tell us where you're from now, Crimson? Asked Orion, trying to buy some time while he thought of a strategy. Crimson knew there was no escaping that question anymore. The question didn't even bother him much anymore. Something had broken inside him, and he could care less. I don't know, he replied. What do you mean you don't know? Mr. Napoleon asked. I don't know, Crimson insisted. You don't know if you're going to tell us? Mr. Napoleon asked. It's not that, replied Crimson. Well, you're not from here for sure. You don't know much about this world, said Mr. Napoleon. I don't, Crimson replied while eating his meat. He was more preoccupied with his tummy issues than with anything else at the moment. What about your mama and papa? Asked Mrs. Layla in a soft and gentle voice. I'm not sure, he replied while yet taking another bite off that crispy, hot piece of meat. It's okay, said Orion. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to. We can talk about something else. Crimson then stopped eating and held the piece of meat in his hand. His mouth and fingers were full of grease. It's not that, he began. I just appeared in this world and I met you all. That's it. Mr. Napoleon asked. How can you talk? Who taught you? I don't remember. The only thing I can remember, or rather, the only thing I dream of, is a large mirror in the grass and a dark silhouette beside it. Huh, Mr. Napoleon sighed. And he paused, a mirror in the grass? Did you see yourself in that mirror? I don't know. In my dreams, I don't, he replied. I wake up soon after I see it. Interesting, said Orion. I know, said Crimson, who was now grabbing another bite of his meat. He seemed more interested in the piece of meat than in his origins. Hunger tends to have that effect. How can you not go crazy? Mr. Napoleon asked. I take that back. You're kinda crazy. That kinda explains it. Crimson stopped eating again. What matters to me now is this land, you, my friends, the love I feel for you, the love I feel for Princess Molly, for Icones, the air I breathe, the forest, the mountains, the oceans, the sky, this piece of meat I am eating. Life. That's what's important, he replied. Today, not yesterday. That was savage, said Orion. Indeed. Hats off to that, said Mr. Napoleon. But where's home for you, Crimson? My friends are my home. The air, the land, the quest itself is home to me, he replied. They were speechless. After a moment, Orion refocused on the quest itself ahead. How are we going to get past the castle? He asked. We attack, muttered Crimson with a mouthful of meat. Yes, but how? Mr. Napoleon asked. Straight on, said Crimson. We can't do that, said Orion. Do you want to die? Mr. Napoleon asked. No, but I do not wish to wait anymore, replied Crimson. As a matter of fact, here I go. Crimson took a last bite of his meat and tossed the bone. He stood up and grabbed his sword. Wait, said Orion. I have a plan. Which is? Crimson asked, glancing back and seeing Orion with the corner of his eye. We look for a weak spot in the barrier and try to break through it with all our force. Too much time to waste, replied Crimson. At least there's a better chance that we will survive like that, not dashing into our death. Or even better, you think you're a hero? Go. Go ahead and go, Crimson. I'm sick and tired of your heroic insolence. Even better, you want to fight? I'll give you a fight right here. Mr. Napoleon exclaimed. He then picked up a stick and bolted towards Crimson. He gave a war cry and hit Crimson with a stick. Crimson blocked it with his sword without much effort. Is that all you got, Crimson? Fight me, you coward. Crimson stopped and pondered for a minute. He was now beginning to realize how foolish he looked, wanting to go attack the castle by himself. Mr. Napoleon had a way of showing him. His attack on Crimson with a stick was a perfect metaphor for what he himself was about to do at the castle. What are you waiting for, hero? Mr. Napoleon yelled at his face, holding up his stick. Crimson was silent. Then he burst into laughter. Ha 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 ha. Then the others laughed with him. He then took a deep breath and sat down once again. You guys are right. My apologies. You have many talents, boy. But I believe warfare strategy would not be one of them, Orion said in a tender, calm, and honest voice. Hothead, Mr. Napoleon said, smiling, and then threw the stick at him. Wherever you come from, you must have been a brat. Ouch, said Crimson. More than the stick. Then they all laughed. How will we find this weak spot in the castle? Crimson asked. We look for it. We attack various parts of the barrier by throwing rocks and see if any area opens, said Orion. Let's go do that then, exclaimed Mr. Napoleon.
Wondrous. Chapter 29.
They grabbed various rocks and put them in their pockets. They walked several minutes towards the castle gate and began to throw rocks from various parts. The rocks disintegrated soon after they hit the plasma barrier. Orion then rode his dragon and commanded the dragon to throw fire at the plasma barrier. The barrier seemed to integrate the fire into the structure. Some sages were seen laughing through the barrier at the other side of the castle gate. Let's concentrate all our powers at the bottom of the barrier, Orion said. All the dragons threw fire at the bottom of the barrier where it met the ground. Nothing happened. We need magic, Orion said. Crimson began to dig the soil right next to where the barrier hit the ground, but the barrier seemed to expand where he had dug, through the ground, and he did not want to risk hitting the barrier again. You're right. We do need magic, said Crimson. They were all exhausted and retreated back to the woods. We need to rest, said Orion. Sounds like a good idea, Mr. Napoleon agreed. It was night and cold. They made a bonfire and fell asleep. Wolves howled from afar. They laid down, defeated in their hearts, exhausted. After a few hours, a crackling of twigs nearby woke up Mr. Napoleon. "Wake up," he said. "Someone is coming. We're under attack." Crimson and Orion drew their swords and stood up, still half asleep. "Where?" Orion asked. "From there, I think," Mr. Napoleon said, pointing at an area of the woods in the opposite direction of where the castle was. "It's an ambush," cried Orion. "The dragons went to eat with my legion. We are alone. Prepare to fight from both sides." They drew their swords ready to attack as they heard the footsteps become louder and clearer. Mr. Napoleon gulped. Orion had his eyes locked on the trees, looking for someone or something hiding. Mrs. Layla held on to Mr. Napoleon. Crimson was sweating and breathing rapidly. Although his heart was pumping fast, he didn't even notice it. The cold of the night felt more piercing than ever. It even felt numbing. The footsteps were now only a few meters away. They were about to come out of the trees any second. Then they stopped. No noise was heard. Nobody knew what was happening. The only sound was the wolves from afar and the crackling of the fire embers left from the bonfire. After a few seconds, a voice was heard. "Here they are," exclaimed a female voice. "It is them," exclaimed a male voice. 3 humanoid figures could now be seen coming out from the trees. They were hiding. Chrisman and company still couldn't make out who they were. They only saw the dark silhouettes, like standing shadows in the night. "Crimson," yelled the female voice, in a bright, high-pitched voice. Crimson glanced at Orion, raising his eyebrow. Orion shook his head and raised his shoulders, signaling he had no idea who it was. The silhouette then came dashing towards Crimson. "Ah!" Crimson screamed, now terrified, taking a guard stance with his sword. But as the silhouette came closer, Crimson was finally able to see who it was. He noticed her mushroom-shaped hat. Molly? His first thought. Could it be? Then the light reached her, and he could see clearly who it was. "Iconis!" Crimson yelled. "You scared me." "I can see that," she replied with a giggle. Crimson then rushed to greet her. He hugged her. Squeezed her, rather. "I'm so glad to see you, dear," he said to her. "So am I, dear," Iconis whispered, smiling, closing her eyes. They both seemed to be lost in time with that embrace. The other 2 silhouettes made their way into the spectacle. "Capra, Raven," said Mrs. Layla. "You know them?" asked Mr. Napoleon, raising his eyebrows, glancing her way. "It doesn't take a genius to figure out that a white goat face is a capra and a black masked and hooded face resembles a raven," she replied. "Capra, Raven," Crimson exclaimed, opening his eyes. He then rushed to greet him. He hugged them. "Glad to see us?" "Dear," Capra said jokingly. They all laughed and Crimson blushed. "I'm glad you're back, Iconis," Orion said, and company. He bowed to Capra and Raven. "Thank you much for coming." "I'm glad to be back," Iconis said, glancing at Crimson and smiling at him. Crimson blushed a little more, but smiled back and then lowered his head. "How's the face-off going?" asked Capra, referencing the battle ahead. "Not good," said Orion. "The sages within the castle walls have summoned a protective barrier all around the castle. We can't penetrate it. We've tried." "What happens?" asked Capra. "Better yet, take me to it." "This way, Sir Capra, and thank you," said Orion, extending his hand up towards the castle, signaling the direction. They all walked towards the castle, close enough so that they could see the white plasma bubble encapsulating the castle. "Avidinmi Nudamark," said Raven, looking at the protective barrier. "Looks like someone remembers their protective barrier spells lessons well," said Capra. "Good job, Raven." Everyone else looked at each other, then back to Capra. "It is almost impossible even for powerful magicians to break through it," said Raven. "Indeed," affirmed Capra. "That's why we're not breaking through it. We're going to break the circle that is holding it together." "You mean the circle of sages that is inside the castle?" asked Mr. Napoleon. "Indeed," said Capra, with his eyes locked towards the castle. But how are we going to get to it? Asked Raven. The circle is inside the castle, which is being protected by a barrier which we cannot get through. There is another spell that could work, but I need an item that connects to one of the sages there, said Capra. An item like what? Asked Orion. A piece of cloth, a piece of hair, any physical object that can relate to them, said Capra. How would we get any of that? Asked Raven. Every physical object that connects to them is in there with them. There was silence. Capra smiled and looked at Raven, expecting a response from him. What about music? Crimson finally asked. Uh-huh, exclaimed Capra. Go on, Sir Crimson. Well, music can travel in wave form, and if we play a melody or sing a lullaby about those sages, it will, by definition, connect to them. It's only a theory, though. Brilliant, exclaimed Capra. You should enroll in my school of magic, Sir Crimson. Why didn't I know that? Complained Raven. I went to school of magic. You were my teacher there, Capra. If I recall correctly now, you were absent the day of that lesson, Raven, Capra replied. That was about 60 years ago, Capra. How could you recall such a specific thing? Raven continued complaining. Well, you know now, Capra replied, smiling. Ugh, exclaimed Raven. So would that work? Asked Orion. That music spell thing Crimson mentioned. It can, but it has to be a good enough song. A song that talks about the sages, or at least one of the sages, replied Capra. Anyone know how to play music here? I can play the flute and the harp, said Icones. I can sing and play guitar, said Crimson. Someone has to write the words for the song, said Capra. Any poets here? I'll write it, said Mrs. Layla, unexpectedly. At least I'll try. Very well. Work on the melody, Icones and Crimson and Mrs. Layla? Capra asked as he glanced at her, not sure that was her name. Yes, that's right. Layla affirmed that was her name. Mrs. Layla, you work on writing the words for the song. Crimson and Icones took out their instruments and began humming possible melodies and playing beautiful harmonies, while Mrs. Layla began to look for something to write in. I don't have a pencil, she said. Gee, why didn't anyone bring a pen to battle? Asked Mr. Napoleon with a sarcastic tone. Use my blood as ink, said Crimson. Whoa. Careful now, boy, warned Capra in a serious tone. You might not want to connect that deep with those sages. Use the hunt's blood as ink, rather, he instructed. They gathered blood from the game they had hunted for food, and Mrs. Layla used it for ink. She wrote the song on a large piece of rock. O sages of the west, sages of the north, sages of the south and sages of the east, you all meet and greet, not knowing you will face defeat. You hide behind castle walls and offer evil's hand your fireballs. Forces of love are stronger than forces of greed. Soon you will regret doing evil deeds. Wise sages, are you wise enough to know that when thy power is used for good, your aura glows? Don't give in to darkness or fear, or else you'll see your end is near. Brilliant, exclaimed Capra as he read it. I think it needs work, said Mrs. Layla. If only I. No time to change it. Orion interrupted. As long as it serves its purpose. Very well, said Capra. Icones, Crimson. Are you ready with the melody? Icones and Crimson had been working on the melody and now had something good to propose. Listen to this, said Crimson. Crimson began to play the guitar, and Icones came in with a melody in her flute. Then Crimson began to hum a melody on top. I like it, said Capra. That should work. Let's make a circle. This is what we will do. I will sit in the middle of the circle, close my eyes, and meditate. Crimson and Icones will begin to play that song, and Crimson will sing the harmony he hummed, but now singing the poem Mrs. Layla wrote. You will do this until I say stop. Understood. Okay, Crimson replied. Understood, said Icones. Very well, said Capra. We shall commence. They drew a circle with a stick, and Capra sat in the middle. Crimson sat at the side of the circle towards the back, and Icones sat on the left side of the circle towards the back. Capra was in front to the left of Crimson, and to the front and right of Icones. The stone with the poem written in blood was in the very front of them all, facing the castle. Orion, draw a line to connect all of our positions with your sword, said Capra. Orion did this. Once the lines were drawn out on the floor, if one could see the circle from above, a round peace symbol would be shown. Begin chanting the melody, instructed Capra. Icones and Crimson began to play and sing the melody, and Capra closed his eyes. He was sitting Indian style. He meditated for several minutes. Then he finally spoke. Diminaski Divitrium, said Capra repeatedly, reciting the spell. Diminaski Divitrium, he said louder and louder, for more than a minute. Capra imagined, with his eyes closed, the waves of the melody piercing through the plasma barrier spell surrounding the castle. He imagined riding that wave and breaking through with it. Once he saw himself inside the castle walls, past the plasma barrier, he opened his eyes. Ah, Mr. Napoleon gasped. Look at his eyes. They look like blue fire. Capra was still sitting down with his blue-flamed eyes and had his eyes locked on the castle. His eyes were shining bright blue, almost white. His pupils were barely noticeable. He stopped reciting the spell. Capra then imagined being there and now focused the wave towards one of the sages inside there, one standing close to the circle they had established there. Ah, gasped the sage inside the castle walls. The others glanced at him. Something is up. The spirit is here, he said. What? The others asked. Capra then tried to focus more of the wave towards him. All of it. The sage cried. He then fell to the floor, breaking the circle. After a few seconds, the plasma ball barrier began to disintegrate. What happened to you? Asked the sages, looking at the sage that fell. Are you possessed? Something is in here. Something pushed me very hard, he said. Oh, Lord Dark Shadow, another sage screamed. Someone has broken in. Lord Dark Shadow was inside the castle, and a soldier went to look for him. Stop singing now, Capra exclaimed back in camp. We broke through. If we continue the chant, they will locate us. Prepare to fight. Orion summoned the dragons, which came to the spot. Orion and his legion went on dragon back, while Crimson drew his sword and charged. The rest followed. Inside the castle walls, Lord Dark Shadow came out. What has happened? He exclaimed. Something invisible broke into the barrier, cried one of the sages. It looks like it possessed a sage and threw him to the ground. Lord Dark Shadow then saw the circle broken and the sage still in the ground, shocked, unwilling to get up. He then glanced outside the castle walls. Diminaski Divitrium, muttered Lord Dark Shadow, looking outside. What was that? Is that a spirit? Asked the sage. Someone has used a spell to break through, exclaimed Lord Dark Shadow. But how? Asked the sage. We haven't gone outside the castle in many months. Prepare to battle, yelled Lord Dark Shadow. You all need to go back to magic school. He growled at the sage. Someone summoned Commander Fiamma. We will fight fire with fire, magic with magic, and sword with sword. A soldier went inside the castle to call for Commander Fiamma. Commander Fiamma, Lord Dark Shadow orders you and your dragons to ready yourselves for battle, said the sage when he reached Fiamma, who was at a kitchen table eating pork. Already, he responded, taking a bite of his meat. I thought it would take them days to break through if they ever could. They're approaching the castle as we speak, Lord, said the sage. Ah, he banged the table and stood up. He then lifted the sage from his chest robe. I will crush them and ash them for interrupting my meal, he growled.
Eerieville-Wondrous Chapter.
Attack the castle, Orion commanded. The dragon he was riding instinctively flew towards him to pick him up. Then they made their way into the castle gate from above. They were met by Lord Dark Shadow and the sage's magic spells. The dragons threw fire from their mouths onto the sages. It was the first wave of attack of the battle. Orion could feel the hot wind blowing from the dragon's fire he was riding on his face. It was way hotter than he was comfortable with, but this was a battle. He knew pain would come. Lord Darkshadow and the sages stopped the fire with a magic shield, but the heat of the fire did reach their hands and faces. "Ah," exclaimed one of the sages. "It's hot." "It's called fire," said Lord Darkshadow sarcastically, deflecting the embers with his hand. "Umatruum Spectrus," he yelled, casting a spell. The spell made his protective barrier turn into a magical mirror, and the fire being thrown upon them began to be deflected back into the air, hitting some of the dragons of Orion's legion. Some of the dragons that were hit cried, Shrierek, and lost balance in midair. The soldiers riding them had to hang on tighter in order to avoid falling down. "Where is Fioma?" yelled Lord Darkshadow. "He should be here any moment," said a sage. "He was notified to come before you and to prepare for battle. But what is the urgency, Lord Darkshadow? We've still got this under control. The sages that broke into our plasma barrier are most likely on their way here now, and we need to be ready to fight them, genius." "Oh," the sage replied with a flat face. He was speechless after that. Sarcastic responses were Lord Darkshadow's trademark. Lord Darkshadow was correct. Capra and Raven were walking towards the castle. "Why are we walking instead of running there, Capra?" asked Raven. "The battle has begun. Are you frightened?" "I'm studying their response behind the walls," Capra replied. "I don't understand," said Raven. "This is no time for studying. It's time to battle. You taught me that." "There is chaos inside the castle walls. They should be sending in their full force any time now," he replied. "How do you know there is chaos in there?" asked Raven. "Because they were not expecting that we would break into their protective barrier," he replied. "At least not so soon." "Which gives us the element of surprise," Raven argued. "We should charge there and help our friends now." "Go if you want. Nobody is stopping you," exclaimed Capra, still looking at the activity behind the castle walls, calculating in his head many possible scenarios. Meanwhile, inside the castle walls, Commander Fioma finally stepped out towards the battlements. "About time," exclaimed Lord Darkshadow, seeing him come out. "Did we interrupt your beauty nap, Commander Fioma?" "I wasn't expecting them to break in so soon," he replied. "It seems like you and your sages are becoming weaker." "Stop making excuses and summon your dragons," yelled Lord Darkshadow. "We've been holding these trying to get in, for you, Princess Fiamma. Are you ready to fight now? Or are you and your dragons still putting on makeup?" Commander Fiamma growled, showing his teeth. "I know what I have to do, Lord Shameshadow." He then made a loud, high-pitched cry towards the other side of the mountain. "Shirek," he summoned his dragons. His shrieks sound just like the shrieking dragons make. A piercing loud, high-pitched, raspy growl. Based on his bipedal humanoid stance, it is easy to forget that he too is part dragon himself. Some faint shrieks and dragon cries were heard from afar the opposite side of the castle in response, up in the austere mountains, and they were becoming louder. They were, without a doubt, getting closer. Soon, tiny silhouettes were seen flying towards them, coming from the mountains. They became larger and larger until they could be seen clearly. They clouded the skies and it became darker. They were the dragons of Commander Fiamma. They were different from the ones Orion and his legion were riding. Fiamma's dragons were a darker shade of earth colors with red stripes and dots instead of orange. They soon landed at the castle and roared. Orion and the legion widened their eyes as they saw their menace now close to them. Meanwhile, Capra and Raven were close to the castle. "We wait here," said Capra. "What? Wait? Perhaps you missed the immense legion of enemy dragons that just arrived at the castle," Raven replied. "The sages are expecting us. If we wait here, they will get confused," Capra replied. "Orion needs our help," said Raven, raising his voice. "Patience, Raven," responded Capra. Crimson, Mr. Napoleon, Mrs. Layla, and Icones were hiding beneath the bridge next to the castle gate, waiting for the right moment to strike. "This is what we will do, Raven," said Capra finally. "Go meet Crimson under the bridge and wait for my signal. When I give the signal, break through the gate and go inside to battle." "Understood." Yes, master, he replied to his teacher. Go now, said Capra. Raven sprinted towards the bridge and met Crimson and company and informed him of Capra's plan. Meanwhile, up in the air, above the very edge of the castle walls themselves, the dragon forces were about to meet head-on. Shriek, shriek, shriek. Fiamma's dragons extended their red wings and took flight, their piercing eyes set on Orion's dragons. They began to drool and smoke would come out of their nostrils. Capra, still analyzing Lord Darkshadow and the sages from a distance, was glued to his ground. Soon, the dragons on both sides finally clashed. Shrieks were heard, and the fire from both sides of the dragons was so intense, it created a black cloud of smoke, and nobody could see which side was injured, and which side had the upper hand in combat. Blood from dragon scratches fell to the ground. Lord Darkshadow, who was standing on the tip of the castle wall's upper part, seemed to have his eyes on the outside of the castle floor, fighting the smoke and looking for the sages that broke through the barrier, but Capra knew this and was hiding well. After several minutes, Lord Darkshadow seemed to grow impatient. Sages, ready yourselves to fight with full force, exclaimed Lord Darkshadow. It seems that the sages that broke through the barrier are either scared, hiding, out smoking, or ran away at the might of Commander Fiamma's dragons. I'm tired of waiting. Let us finish this battle once and for all. Attack the orange dragons, but don't kill them. They will be put to the Mosquito Queen's service. Ha 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 ha. Lord Darkshadow then glanced towards Commander Fiamma. It seems like you'll have a full schedule training dragons ahead of you, Fiamma. Unless you're too busy eating and beauty sleeping, I'll be glad to train them myself. Ha ha ha. Fiamma growled in response. Lord Darkshadow and the sages began to throw power balls of magic at Orion's dragons. Capra then finally signaled Raven from a distance to break the door down. Raven then threw a fireball onto the wooden door gate, and it burned to the ground. Only the metal brackets holding the door remained. Capra then flew towards the air where the dragon battle was at and began to deflect and block the magic power balls that Lord Darkshadow and the sages were throwing at Orion's dragons. So it was you, Capra, exclaimed Lord Darkshadow as he saw Capra enter the battle scene midair. I should have guessed your little secret music spell. Happy to see me, Mr. Snaky Shadow? Capra asked, smiling. Delighted, replied Lord Darkshadow, laughing. I was beginning to get bored here. Finally, a decent match. They continued fighting midair, Capra, the dragons, Lord Darkshadow, and the sages. Meanwhile, Crimson's party was met by mosquito soldiers at the other side of the castle gate once the gate was thrown down. Crimson drew his sword and charged towards them. He was the first to give the war cry, slashing sword to sword with the mosquito soldiers' resistance. Some of them were hovering with their buzzing wings. Their needle beak was frightening enough, but they also carried several swords and shields with their multiple limbs, midair. The rest of the party soon caught up with Crimson. Raven used magic and martial arts skills, Iconies used magic as well, and Mr. Napoleon and Mrs. Layla used sticks, but the otter pair was being protected by Raven and Iconies in battle. How does it feel to finally fight Iconies? Raven asked, smiling. Awkward, she replied frankly, but with a giggle. Do not feel guilty, my friend, Raven said. You're fighting to protect the lives of many. There was a fight on the ground and a fight in the air. Orion's trooper commander Elias cried. He was scratched by one of Fiamma's dragons as he burned the dragon Elias was riding. The burnt dragon fell to the ground and Elias was caught by Fiamma's dragon. Elias, cried Orion as he approached to rescue his friend. Eat him, Fiamma instructed his dragon. No, take him inside, said Lord Darkshadow. His blood is for the Mosquito Queen. Fiamma growled and then commanded his dragon to place Elias inside a tower in the castle. The dragon obeyed Fiamma. Meet your end, Dark Dragon. Orion exclaimed as flew to fight Commander Fiamma. Eha! Orion let out a fierce battle cry while shedding tears for his comrade, Elias. Orion clashed with Fiamma and nailed him to the ground. Several dragons came to aid Commander Fiamma. Lord Darkshadow then noticed Crimson's fight down at the castle gates as well, and he sent some sages to aid the battle on the ground. 3 sages to the gate, exclaimed Lord Darkshadow. 3 sages went there and began to fight against Crimson's company. Raven, despite having excellent magic and martial arts skills, began to feel overwhelmed by the power of 3 sages against them. Retreat, exclaimed Raven. No, cried Crimson. We're so close. It's not the time to be a hero, boy. At least not yet, yelled Napoleon. Ah, Crimson yelled, hitting a mosquito soldier with its sword. Let's retreat then. We need to protect our party, Raven said. They began to retreat slowly, but were still fighting their enemy up front while walking backwards. If they turned away, they would be caught and injured. Could this be it? Crimson thought to himself. Did they beat us? This isn't how it was supposed to go down. We were supposed to win, enter the castle, and rescue Princess Molly. His breathing became heavier and felt a lump in his throat. His knees began to weaken, shaking a little. The ground's gravity seemed to be pulling him down with exponentially increasing force, and soon he felt like he was going to meet the very same soil he was standing upon. Just as a cloud of darkness embraced Crimson's field of vision, they heard many screams and war cries coming from the trees behind them. What? Asked Napoleon as he glanced back. I can't believe this. Crimson then turned around as well and saw Socrates with a party of bears, wolves, humanoid creatures, and other forest creatures charging their way. It's Socrates, Mrs. Layla cried. Push forward, cried Crimson, who noticed the additional forces coming to their aid. Soon, Socrates and company reached the gate and fought alongside Crimson's company. I'm glad you joined the battle, exclaimed Crimson to Socrates. I'm actually very thankful for that, sir. Crimson had a huge and bright smile on his face and felt a spirit of strength take hold of his body once more. Thank me later, kid, when we win, Socrates replied. Or better yet, thank these people. They went into the forest and convinced me to come fight. Who are they? Asked Crimson. We were prisoners inside the castle, one of the humans said. Princess Molly set us free inside the dungeon. Princess Molly, exclaimed Crimson. How is she? We have to get her out of there. Yes, said the human. She is alive. We promised her we would come back and save her. It was quite difficult for them to have a conversation while fighting a battle. They had to yell and avoid the attacks from the mosquito soldiers and sages they were fighting at the same time. As soon as we get through, I'm going to go save her, said Crimson. They continued battling the mosquito soldier forces and the sages, and now with the help of Socrates and the others. They were able to push through into the castle gate, now finally breaching it. Raven battled the 3 sages by himself, throwing power balls of magic and spells. Crimson and company fought the mosquito soldiers. Some of the defeated mosquito soldiers fell off the wooden bridge into the maroon-stained swamp below. Together, they pushed them through the castle patio entrance all the way back. Soon, they were almost at the castle door entrance itself. Lord Darkshadow was seeing this. He saw Socrates and company join Crimson, and thus he sent more sages to the ground battle immediately. You, and you. Lord Darkshadow pointed at 7 sages, go to the ground battle. Now, the 7 sages went to the ground. Raven heard Lord Darkshadow from afar. Also, warn Lady Annalise Gertrude and summon Greybite. Lord Darkshadow continued. A sage went inside to do as he was told. Quick, Crimson. This might be the only chance you'll get to get inside the castle. New forces are coming to fight here against us. We'll hold them off for you, but you must go in now, exclaimed Raven. I'll go in now. Cover me, exclaimed Crimson as he pushed his way into the castle door. Raven and the others fought in front of him, pushing the mosquito soldiers aside, thus allowing Crimson to go through. He was soon at the castle entrance door. He opened it and went inside the castle itself. Icones went in with him. The other 7 sages arrived at the ground battle. The mosquito soldiers and them tried to go in and stop Crimson, but Icones used a powerful translucid barrier spell to stop them. Quick, go. We'll hold them for you, exclaimed Icones, saying farewell. Thank you, Icones. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for coming all the way here. Thank you for fighting. Thank you for being my real, true friend, said Crimson. Promise me you will come back, Crimson, said Icones. For the love I have for this land and its inhabitants, I promise I will come back to you, my dear friend, replied Crimson. I'm so glad I met you, Icones. I hope we party together after this. I hope so too, she replied. A wonderful destiny awaits us, my friend. For our destiny, Crimson exclaimed, drawing his sword. He then turned and faced the interior of the castle. Its walls were made of earthen gray bricks. The smell of trapped swamp was introduced into his lungs. A wide round-up staircase was in the middle. Behind, 2 armed mosquito soldiers began to hover towards him from the opposite side of the entrance room. Molly, here I am, he whispered. He charged inside the castle alone.